Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The moss hung thick enough to muffle sound, turning the Hoh River Trail into a green cathedral of silence. Logan Mitchell had walked this same 3-mile section every Tuesday morning for 2 years, and the forest had never felt wrong before. But today, October 14, 2008, something had shifted in the quality of the quiet. The Sitka spruce and western hemlock rose around him like the pillars of some vast organic architecture, their bark dark with perpetual moisture, and he found himself counting his steps between the mile markers, a habit from before, from the bad time, from when counting helped keep the memories at bay. His Garmin eTrex GPS showed him at exactly mile 1.7, elevation 578 feet, which matched the weathered wooden post to his left. Everything aligned. Everything made sense. That should have been his first warning. Logan was 34 years old and had been with the National Park Service for 9 years, the last 2 stationed here in the Olympic wilderness after requesting the transfer. After what happened in Yosemite. After Emma. He pressed his thumb against the scar on his left palm, a thin white line from a fall he barely remembered, and pushed the thought away. The psychiatrist in Port Angeles had called it a coping mechanism, this need to catalog and verify physical reality. Logan called it survival. The morning rain had stopped an hour ago, but water still dripped from every branch, every fern frond, creating a constant patter that almost sounded like footsteps. Almost. He'd learned to distinguish the difference. Real footsteps had a rhythm, a weight. Water was random, chaotic. These sounds were random, mostly random. His Motorola MTS 2000 radio crackled. "Ranger Mitchell, you copy? Go ahead, dispatch." He recognized Julie's voice, the daytime dispatcher who always sounded slightly bored. "We've got a concerned party calling about a hiker. Hannah Reeves, 28, solo backpacker. She checked in at the ranger station 3 days ago for a 2-night backcountry permit. She was supposed to check out yesterday morning. Didn't show." Logan stopped walking. The forest seemed to lean in, listening. Last known location? She filed for campsite 12 at mile 2.3 on the Hoh River Trail. You're probably close. Mile 2.3, he was at 1.7, just over half a mile ahead. Copy that. I'm maybe 15 minutes out. I'll investigate and report back. Roger. Probably just sleeping in or lost track of time, but protocol is protocol. Understood. He clipped the radio back to his belt and adjusted the weight of his pack. Inside, first aid kit, emergency bivvy, 550 cord, water purification tablets, 3 protein bars, a laminated topographic map of the region, and his personal notebook, the one he wasn't supposed to need anymore, but still carried everywhere. The one with Emma's name written on the first page. The trail curved ahead, following the glacial blue Hoh River as it rushed over stones worn smooth by millennia. Logan had read that some of the Sitka spruce in this forest were over 500 years old, standing before Columbus reached the Americas. The Hoh rainforest received almost 12 feet of rain annually, creating this otherworldly landscape of ferns, moss, and enormous trees draped in epiphytes. It was beautiful. It was pristine. It was also one of the easiest places on Earth to get disoriented if you left the maintained trails. Hannah Reeves, 28, solo, 3 days. He walked faster. The mile markers passed with their usual reliability. 1.8, 1.9, 2.00. At mile 2.1, Logan noticed the first anomaly. A Douglas fir, easily 300 years old, had a spiral of moss growing up its trunk in a pattern that defied the usual north-facing preference. The moss circled the tree in a perfect helix like a barber pole green against dark bark. He stopped and stared at it, something tickling the back of his mind. Moss didn't grow like that. Moss followed light, followed moisture gradients. Moss didn't spiral. He almost took out his notebook to sketch it, then caught himself. Not everything was significant. Not everything meant something. The psychiatrist had been clear about that. Mile 2.2. The forest here grew denser, the canopy so thick that even mid-morning light barely penetrated. Logan pulled out his flashlight, a mag light that had been his father's, and clicked it on. The beam cut through the green gloom, illuminating countless suspended water droplets that hung motionless in the still air, giving the atmosphere a crystalline quality, as if he were walking through the inside of a geode. Mile 2.3. The trail marker stood where it should, but the wooden signpost pointing toward campsite 12 was missing. Snapped off clean, about a foot from the base. Logan knelt and examined the break. Fresh. The wood was pale and still slightly damp, not weathered gray. Something had broken this within the last few days. Something strong. He looked at the ground, searching for tracks, but the constant rain had turned everything to mud. And if there had been prints, they were gone now. "Hannah Reeves?" he called out. His voice sounded flat, absorbed by the moss. "National Park Service, are you here?" Nothing. The forest breathed its perpetual wet silence. The side trail to campsite 12 was barely visible, overgrown with sword ferns that brushed against his waterproof pants as he pushed through. 50 yards in, the trail opened into a small clearing beside a tributary of the Ho River. This was campsite 12, a flat area about 20 feet across, a fire ring of stones and a cleared spot where a tent should have been. Should have been. Logan stood at the edge of the clearing and felt his heart begin to accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with exertion. The campsite was there, all of it. The tent, a green two-person Sierra Designs model, stood fully erected, its rainfly properly secured. A bear canister sat beside the fire ring, regulation distance from the tent. A pair of hiking boots, women's size 7 or 8, were placed neatly outside the tent flap. A water bottle, a drying towel hung from a low branch. Everything exactly as it should be, except there was no one here. "Hannah?" He said it quieter this time, approaching the tent slowly. His right hand moved to the canister of bear spray on his belt without conscious thought. "Hannah Reeves, this is Ranger Mitchell. I need you to respond if you can hear me." The tent was sealed. The zipper was closed from the inside. Logan circled it once, looking for any sign of disturbance. The ground showed no obvious tracks, but that meant little in this mud. The fire ring was cold, no recent ashes. The bear canister was locked. He could see the green indicator showing it was properly sealed. Everything suggested someone who had stepped away from camp for a few minutes. Maybe to use the restroom in the woods, maybe to fetch water from the stream, maybe to take photographs of the incredible moss-draped trees that surrounded the site. Except Hannah had been missing for 24 hours. "I'm opening your tent," Logan announced to the empty forest. "For your safety and welfare." He unzipped it slowly, the sound of the teeth separating loud in the silence. Inside, a sleeping bag, neatly rolled, a stuffed sack of clothes, a headlamp hanging from the ceiling loop, a paperback novel, he could see the spine, The Dharma Bums by Kerouac, a journal, closed, and on top of the journal, centered perfectly, a small pile of objects that made Logan's hands begin to tremble. 7 stones, arranged in a circle. Inside the circle, a sprig of hemlock. And in the center of the arrangement, drawn in what looked like ash or charcoal, a symbol he didn't recognize. 3 lines radiating from a central point, each line ending in a spiral. Logan sat back on his heels. His scar itched. His scar always itched when things weren't right. He pulled out his radio. "Dispatch, this is Mitchell." "Go ahead." "I'm at campsite 12. The tent is here, all the gear is here, but no sign of the hiker. Site shows no obvious signs of struggle, but..." He paused, looking at the symbol again. "I'm going to need a full search and rescue team. This doesn't feel right." "Copy, I'll contact Olympic SAR. ETA probably 2 hours. You want me to send backup now?" Logan thought about it. 2 hours for the SAR team. Another ranger could be here in maybe 45 minutes coming up from the Saul Duke side, but what would they do except wait with him? Negative. I'm going to do a quick area search, 50-yard radius. I'll stay in radio contact. Roger that. Check in every 15 minutes. Will do. He stood and turned to begin his search, and that's when he saw them. The trees. At the edge of the clearing, 7 western hemlocks grew in a perfect circle, their trunks exactly equidistant from each other, their tops bending inward as if drawn together by invisible wires. In 34 years of life, 9 years as a ranger, Logan had never seen trees grow in a geometric pattern. Trees grew toward light, toward space, in competition with their neighbors. Trees didn't collaborate, trees didn't form circles, but these 7 did. He approached them slowly, that itching in his scar spreading up his arm. The spacing was too perfect, maybe 8 feet between each trunk, and on each trunk, at exactly eye level, was carved the same symbol from Hannah's tent. 3 radiating lines, each ending in a spiral. The carvings weren't fresh. They were old, the bark beginning to heal around the edges, suggesting years rather than days. Someone had marked these trees long before Hannah Reeves arrived at campsite 12. Logan pulled out his notebook and sketched the symbol quickly, his hand moving almost automatically. As he drew, fragments of memory surfaced, something from a training he'd attended years ago back in Yosemite, about cultural sensitivity and indigenous sites. The instructor had mentioned something about old-growth forests and sacred spaces, about how some areas had histories that predated national parks by centuries, by millennia, about how some places were marked as... His radio crackled. Mitchell, check in. He glanced at his watch. Had 15 minutes passed already? It felt like 30 seconds. I'm here, extending the search radius. Found some unusual markings on trees around the site, documenting everything. Unusual how? How did he explain it? Some kind of symbols carved into the bark. Old carvings, not recent. Might be historical significance. I'll photograph everything. Copy. Keep us posted. Logan pulled out his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot that he used for incident documentation, and began taking pictures. The symbol on each tree, the arrangement of the 7 trees, the tent, the strange spiral pattern of moss he'd seen on the trail. As he worked, he felt that familiar dissociative feeling creeping in, the sense that he was watching himself from outside his body, that the Logan taking pictures wasn't quite the same Logan who was thinking these thoughts. The psychiatrist had warned him about this, about how trauma created these gaps in consciousness, these moments of unreality. But this was real. The camera's LCD screen showed him the images. The trees were actually growing in a circle. The symbols were actually carved into the bark. He completed the circle of trees and found himself back where he started, at Hannah's tent. The journal sat there still closed. Logan hesitated, then picked it up. Privacy was one thing, but the woman had been missing for a day. Her own writings might provide clues. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, the evening she arrived. Campsite 12, finally here. The forest is even more incredible than the photos. The trees are like something from a fairy tale. I swear I can feel them watching me, if that makes sense. Not in a creepy way. More like being in the presence of something very old and very aware. I set up the tent right where the trail guide suggested. There's this perfect circle of hemlocks that create a natural shelter, almost like a room with a ceiling of branches. I feel safe here. I feel like I'm supposed to be here, going to meditate before bed and really soak in the energy of this place. Tomorrow I'm heading up to the Blue Glacier if the weather holds. For now, I'm just grateful. This is exactly what I needed after everything that happened in Seattle. Logan read it twice. The tone was cheerful, optimistic. Not the writing of someone planning to disappear. Not the writing of someone in danger. But there was nothing after that entry. No note about leaving camp. No mention of where she was going. He flipped backward through the journal. Most entries were typical hiker observations. Mileage covered, wildlife spotted, thoughts about the landscape. But interspersed throughout were sketches. Hannah was an artist. She'd drawn the trees, the river, detailed studies of ferns and moss. And on one page, dated a week before she arrived, she'd sketched the same symbol from the tree carvings. Beneath it, she'd written, Found this in a book at Elliott Bay. Mark of the Forest Lord. Eastern European folklore. Protector spirits of old-growth woodlands. Used to ward off evil or ask permission to enter sacred groves. Feels relevant somehow. We'll research more. Logan's hand holding the journal began to shake. He set it down carefully and stood up. The clearing felt smaller suddenly, the circle of hemlocks pressing in. The quality of light had changed. Dimmer, greener, as if the canopy had thickened in the last few minutes, though that was impossible. He pulled out his GPS unit. Mile 2.3, elevation 612 feet. He looked at the screen, then looked again. The elevation was wrong. Campsite 12 was at 580 feet, give or take. He'd checked the topographic map 100 times. The GPS was off by 30 feet. 30 feet. Logan tapped the screen. Sometimes the satellites were inaccurate, especially under heavy canopy. He waited for it to recalculate. The numbers flickered. Mile 2.3, elevation 643 feet. That couldn't be right. That would put him on a hillside a quarter-mile to the west. He hit the reset button. Waited. The GPS found its satellites, 7 of them, good signal, and settled on a location. Mile 2.1, elevation 579 feet. Mile 2.1, but he was at campsite 12, which was at mile 2.3. He'd passed the marker. He'd walked the trail. He'd counted his steps the way he always did, unless he hadn't. Logan turned in a slow circle, examining the clearing with fresh attention. It looked exactly like campsite 12. The fire ring was in the right place. The distance to the stream was correct, but if his GPS was accurate, he was 0.2 of a mile too early. His radio crackled. Mitchell, check in. Another 15 minutes? Time was moving strangely. Still here? Dispatch, can you confirm the coordinates for campsite 12? A pause, the sound of clicking keys. Campsite 12 on Ho River Trail is at 47.862 north, 123.9347 west. Elevation 580 feet. You got something different? Logan looked at his GPS screen. It showed his position as 47.8589 north, 123.9382 west. Different numbers entirely. Stand by, he said into the radio, then louder, to the forest. What the hell is happening? The words came out more desperate than he'd intended, echoing slightly in the clearing before being absorbed by the moss, and in that brief moment of echo, Logan heard something else. Another voice, distant and faint, overlapping with his own. A voice that said the same words but with a different accent, a different intonation. He spun, scanning the tree line. Nothing, just the circle of hemlocks and their carved symbols and the green gloom beyond. "Hannah!" he shouted. "Hannah Reeves!" This time he was sure. In the echo, another voice shouting the same name. Not his voice, someone else's, coming from everywhere and nowhere. Logan's training said to stay calm, to radio for backup, to wait for the SAR team. But his instinct, the instinct that had kept him alive for 9 years in the wilderness, said something was deeply wrong with this place. The trees growing in patterns that trees didn't grow, the GPS showing impossible locations, the echo that spoke with borrowed voices, and Hannah Reeves, who had read about forest lords and drawn their symbols, and then vanished from a locked tent in the middle of an ancient forest. Logan made a decision. He would search the immediate area for 1 more hour. If he found nothing, he would wait for SR at this spot. 1 hour. That was reasonable. That was protocol adjacent. He started walking, keeping the campsite in sight, moving in a careful spiral outward. The underbrush here was thick, salal and Oregon grape and walls of ferns, but there were game trails, narrow paths where elk or deer had pushed through. He followed one that led roughly north, away from the river, uphill into denser forest. 20 yards in, he found the second tent. It was older, a Kelty model from the 1990s. Its green fabric faded to a pale sage, half collapsed from broken poles. Logan approached it carefully. No recent tracks. The fabric was covered in moss, suggesting it had been here for years, not days. He opened the flap. Inside, a rotted sleeping bag, a rusted camping stove, and a journal. Its pages swollen with moisture but still partially readable. Logan picked it up gingerly. The first page had a name and date: Michael Torres, June 2003. 5 years ago. He flipped through carefully. Most pages were illegible, the ink run together into blue-gray smears, but fragments remained. The trees don't end where they should. Walked for 6 hours and ended up where I started. Something watching from told me I violated. Please, if anyone finds this. The last entry, barely visible. The spiral. It's all spirals. The moss, the branches, even the path leads back. He showed me. The Leshy showed me. This is his forest. We were never supposed to. The word Leshy was underlined 3 times. Logan felt a coldness spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the October temperature. He knew that word. He'd heard it before, in another context, in another life. Emma had studied folklore, had written her master's thesis on Slavic forest mythology. She'd talked about the Leshy sometimes late at night in their tent, her voice excited as she explained: ancient spirits, guardians of the wild, tricksters who led travelers astray. They protected old forests from human intrusion, she'd said. They were neither evil nor good, just ancient and territorial. Emma, who had disappeared in Yosemite 3 years ago while photographing old-growth cedars. Emma, whose body they never found. Logan's hands clenched the journal so hard the waterlogged pages tore. No, not the same. This was different. This was Hannah Reeves in Olympic National Park in 2008. Not Emma Chen in Yosemite in 2005. Different forest, different circumstances, different. But the same spiral symbols, the same impossible geometry, the same vanishing. He took out his radio with shaking hands. Dispatch, this is Mitchell. I need you to run a search for any reported disappearances in the Ho River Trail area. Historical data, last 20 years. That's going to take some time. What's going on out there? Just do it, please. He tried to keep his voice level. And send that back up now. I don't care about the 2-hour wait for SAR. I need someone here now. A longer pause. Copy. I'm sending Ranger Davidson up from the south. He's about 40 minutes out. Mitchell, are you okay? Was he okay? He was standing in a forest that wasn't following the right coordinates, holding a journal from a dead man who described the same symbols he was seeing everywhere, thinking about his disappeared fiancée, and listening to the trees whisper with voices that weren't quite wind. I'm fine, he lied. Just hurry. He clipped the radio back and forced himself to breathe slowly. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The psychiatrist's technique for managing panic. It helped, marginally. He looked at Michael Torres's journal again, focusing on that name. Leshy. Logan had dismissed Emma's folklore research as academic curiosity, but she'd been passionate about it. She'd explained that Leshy legends were strongest in Russia and Eastern Europe, but variations existed everywhere humans lived near ancient forests. The spirits went by different names: Basajan in Basque country, Woodwoes in England, Bukovac in the Balkans. But the core concept remained constant. There were guardians in the old places, and they did not welcome intrusion. Emma had theorized that these legends emerged from a real phenomenon, something about ancient forests that affected human psychology, made people disoriented, paranoid. She'd called it spatial confusion disorder, and thought it might be related to magnetic anomalies or infrasound from wind through unusual tree formations. But that didn't explain the symbols. That didn't explain 3 people, Michael Torres, Emma Chen, Hannah Reeves, disappearing under identical circumstances. That didn't explain why his GPS coordinates kept changing. Logan checked it again. Mile 2.4, elevation 621 feet. He hadn't moved. He was standing in the same spot. But according to the GPS, he'd walked 1/10 of a mile uphill. He looked at the trees around him. 7 hemlocks in a circle, just like at Hannah's campsite. No, not just like. The exact same trees, the exact same arrangement. He could see the carved symbols at eye level, the 3 radiating lines ending in spirals. Logan spun, searching for the collapsed tent he'd just been examining. It should be right there, 20 yards behind him. But there was only forest, salal and ferns, and the eternal green twilight. "No," he said aloud. "No, I was just there. I walked here. I walked in a straight line." But had he? The trail had curved. There had been game paths intersecting. The underbrush had forced him to zigzag, and all the while, the trees had stood in their impossible circles, marked with their impossible symbols. Logan pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on magnetic north. It rotated slowly clockwise, then counterclockwise, as if the poles themselves were uncertain. He looked at his watch. The hands showed 11:47 a.m., but he'd checked it just moments ago when the radio called, and it had been 10:15. That couldn't be right. He hadn't been walking for 90 minutes, 20 minutes, maybe 30 at most. Unless time here didn't work the way time was supposed to work. Logan felt his breathing accelerate. The psychiatrist had warned him about this, the cascade effect, where one panic trigger led to another, spiraling into a full breakdown. He needed to ground himself. He needed to find something real, something solid, something that made sense. He looked down at his feet. His boots, a Solo TPS 520s, size 11, with the distinctive tread pattern he'd memorized, stood firmly on the ground. Real. He could feel the earth beneath him. He bent and touched the soil. Damp, cold, with that distinctive smell of decomposition and growth that defined temperate rainforests. Real. The tree next to him. He reached out and pressed his palm against the bark. Rough, textured, with moss growing in patches. He scraped some off with his thumbnail. The bark beneath was solid, real, following the normal patterns of tree physiology. Except, the moss he'd scraped away revealed something underneath. Another carving, older than the symbol, nearly grown over. Letters, painstakingly etched into the wood decades ago. Logan leaned closer, tracing them with his finger. E. Johnston, 1967. Help, the word help was underlined, carved deeper than the others. 41 years ago, someone named E. Johnston had been here, had carved this message, had needed help, and the forest had swallowed it, grown moss over it, hidden it like all the other secrets it kept. How many, Logan thought. How many people had walked into this forest and never walked out? How many had found the circles of trees and the spiral symbols? How many had felt time slip away and space fold back on itself? His radio crackled, but the voice that came through was wrong. It was Julie's voice, but the words were layered, echoing as if multiple Julies were speaking slightly out of sync. Mitchell, check in. Position. We're losing your signal. Coordinates. Not matching. Where are you? Mitchell. I'm here, he shouted into the radio. Campsite 12, mile 2.3, I'm right here. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. He wasn't at Campsite 12. He didn't know where he was. The GPS showed one location. His map suggested another. And his instinct screamed that he was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the map didn't show. Somewhere that existed in the spaces between the marked miles. A sound made him turn. Footsteps. Real footsteps. With rhythm and weight, coming from deeper in the forest. Logan pulled out his flashlight, his bear spray, his heart hammering. "Hannah?" he called. "Hannah Reeves?" The footsteps stopped. In the silence that followed, Logan heard breathing. Not his own. Someone else's, rapid and panicked. "I'm a ranger," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "National Park Service. I'm here to help. If you can hear me, please respond." A voice emerged from the green shadows. Female, young, terrified. "You can't help. You're in it now. You're in the spiral." "Hannah, is that you?" She stepped into view, and Logan felt relief flood through him despite everything. Hannah Reeves looked exactly like her permit photo. 28, athletic build, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, except for her eyes. Her eyes held something Logan recognized intimately, the 1,000-yard stare of someone who had seen past the veil of comfortable reality into something vast and incomprehensible. "You need to stop looking for me," she said, her voice flat. "You need to go back. Follow the river. Only the river stays true. The trails lie. The trees lie. Everything here lies except the water." Logan took a step toward her. "Hannah, I'm Ranger Logan Mitchell. I'm here to take you out of the forest. You've been missing for 24 hours. People are worried." She laughed, a bitter sound. 24 hours? I've been walking for 3 days. I found my campsite 17 times. I've walked past Michael Torres's tent 8 times. I've seen the same circle of trees so many times I've lost count. This isn't a forest anymore. This is something else. Then let's leave together right now. We'll follow the river like you said. You don't understand. He won't let us. We violated his territory. We marked ourselves when we slept in the circles. We accepted his hospitality, and now we owe him. Who won't let us, Hannah? Who are you talking about? She met his eyes, and in that moment Logan saw his own face reflected in her terror. The Leshy, she whispered. The Forest Lord. The Guardian. He's been here longer than the trees, and the trees are 500 years old. He doesn't want to hurt us. He just wants us to understand. We don't belong here, we never did. The forest around them seemed to pulse with her words, the trees leaning incrementally closer, the light dimming another shade. There's no such thing, Logan said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's a legend. Folklore. Then why are we lost? Hannah asked simply. We're both experienced hikers. We both have GPS. We both know how to navigate. And yet here we are, in a circle of trees we've both seen before, having the same conversation that Michael Torres probably had, that E. Johnston had, that dozens of others had before us. The Leshy doesn't make you disappear. He makes you walk. Forever. In spirals. Logan's radio crackled again. Mitchell. Davidson is en route. ETA 30 minutes. Your signal keeps jumping. Stay where you are. 30 minutes. Could he hold himself together for 30 minutes? Could Hannah? We're going to wait right here, Logan said firmly, injecting command into his voice. Another ranger is coming. We'll wait together, and when he arrives, we'll all walk out. The 3 of us. Safety in numbers. Hannah shook her head slowly. He won't find us, or he'll find us, but he'll become part of the spiral too. That's how it works. The forest protects itself. It always has. Logan wanted to argue, wanted to insist on rational explanations, but he couldn't. Because everything Hannah said aligned with what he'd experienced. The impossible coordinates, the repeating landscapes, the symbol carved by someone in 1967, by someone in 2003, by Hannah Reeves in 2008, by how many others in between. Emma, he whispered, the name escaping before he could stop it. Hannah's head tilted. Who's Emma? My fiancée. She disappeared in Yosemite 3 years ago. Old-growth forest. They never found her. I always thought... He couldn't finish. Couldn't say that he'd thought she'd gotten lost, maybe fallen, maybe encountered a bear. Ordinary tragedies, natural causes. But what if it hadn't been ordinary? What if Yosemite had its own circles, its own spirals, its own guardian? I'm sorry, Hannah said, and she sounded like she meant it. But maybe she's like Michael. Maybe she's still walking. Maybe they all are. Everyone who ever got lost in a forest and never came out. Maybe we're joining a very old procession. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, Logan felt a strange calm settle over him. If Emma was still out there, still walking through some eternal forest, then maybe he could find her. Maybe that's what all of this had been for. The transfer to Olympic, the careful cataloging of reality, the refusal to accept her death without a body. Maybe he'd been walking a spiral of his own, one that started 3 years ago and was only now completing its circuit. His GPS flickered. Mile 2.3, elevation 580 feet. Back to the original coordinates. Back to where campsite 12 should be. It's playing with us, Hannah said. Showing us where we think we want to be, but we're not there. We're never there. Logan looked at his watch. The hands spun backward, showing 9:30 a.m., then forward to 2:15 p.m., then stopped at 11:47 again. Time, like space, had become negotiable. "The symbol," he said suddenly. "The 3 spirals. What does it mean?" Hannah reached into her pocket and pulled out a small paperback. Not the Kerouac from her tent, but something older, water-damaged. She handed it to him. The cover was in Cyrillic, but Logan recognized a few words from Emma's research. Lesnoi Duch, forest spirit. "I found this at a used bookstore before the trip," Hannah explained. "It's about Slavic forest guardians. The symbol represents the 3 aspects of the Leshy: he who watches, he who guides, he who keeps. The spirals show that all paths in his forest lead back to him. You can walk for miles, for years, for lifetimes, but you're always right where he wants you." Logan opened the book carefully. The pages were filled with dense Russian text, but throughout were illustrations, trees in circles, spiral patterns, and figures that were half man, half tree, crowned with branches and leaves. In one image, a Leshy stood at the center of a clearing while dozens of human figures walked in circles around him, their faces blank, their feet following paths that looped endlessly. "We're not the first," Hannah said unnecessarily, "and we won't be the last." A voice echoed through the forest, distant but clear. "Mitchell, Hannah Reeves, call out if you can hear me." Davidson, the backup ranger. Logan felt a surge of hope. "Here," he shouted. "We're here. Follow my voice." He pulled out his whistle, standard SAR equipment, and blew 3 sharp blasts. The sound should have carried for a quarter mile or more, should have given Davidson a clear direction. Instead, it seemed to curve away, bending around the trees, spiraling upward into the canopy. Hannah grabbed his arm. "Don't. You'll just bring him in too. We need help. We need to get out, and the only way out is to understand. That's what the book says. The Leshy traps those who take without asking, who enter sacred spaces without permission, but he releases those who understand, who show respect, who acknowledge his authority." Logan stared at her. "You're saying we need to apologize to a forest spirit? Ask permission retroactively? I'm saying we need to acknowledge this place for what it is. Not a park, not a trail, not human territory with human rules. This is his domain, and we walked in like we owned it." It was insane. It violated everything Logan understood about the world, about nature, about the rational universe. But the alternative was walking in circles until he died of exposure or starvation or simple despair, just like Michael Torres, just like E. Johnston, just like Emma. "What do we do?" he asked. Hannah looked at the circle of 7 hemlocks. "We make an offering. We show respect. The book says the Leshy accepts 3 things: tobacco, bread, and truth. I don't have tobacco or bread, but truth." She took a shaking breath. "Truth I have." She walked to the center of the clearing and knelt. Logan followed. Up close, he could see the symbol drawn in ash on the ground between the trees, the same symbol from her tent, from the carved bark, from the old book. "I violated this place," Hannah said clearly, speaking to the forest itself. "I came without asking permission. I slept in a sacred space. I took its peace and offered nothing in return. I'm sorry. I'm ignorant. And I'm sorry. Please let me leave. Please let me remember this lesson." The words felt awkward, embarrassing, like talking to air. But as Hannah spoke them, Logan felt something shift. The quality of light changed, becoming less green, more golden. The oppressive weight he hadn't consciously noticed began to lift. His turn. Logan closed his eyes. "I violated this place," he said, the words rough in his throat. "I came looking for someone without respecting what this forest is. I brought my tools and my maps and my authority, and I forgot that some places don't recognize human authority. I'm sorry." He paused, then added, "And I'm sorry for Yosemite too. For Emma. For whatever she did without knowing. Please, if she's still walking, Let her rest. Let her find peace. And let us go home. Silence. The forest held its breath. Then, from somewhere both very far and very close, a sound. Not wind, not water. Something else. A rustling of leaves that formed almost words. A creaking of wood that suggested almost laughter. And in that sound, Logan heard something that might have been acceptance, or dismissal, or simply acknowledgement that humans had spoken and been heard. When he opened his eyes, the 7 hemlocks still formed their circle, but the symbols carved into them were gone. Not faded, not grown over, simply gone, as if they had never existed. The ash symbol on the ground was gone too, absorbed into the soil. His GPS showed mile 2.3, elevation 580 feet. His watch showed 12:15 p.m. His compass pointed steady north. "Mitchell, Reeves, respond." Davidson's voice, much closer now. Logan looked at Hannah. She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling. "Here," Logan shouted. "We're here at campsite 12. Footsteps crashed through the underbrush, and then Davidson appeared, a tall ranger in his 50s with a gray beard and concerned eyes. "Jesus Christ, you two okay? We've been trying to track your signal for an hour, kept bouncing all over the map." "Equipment malfunction," Logan said automatically. "GPS was glitching, but we're fine. Hannah's fine. We're both fine." Davidson looked between them, clearly unconvinced. "You sure? You both look like you've seen a ghost." Hannah laughed, slightly hysterical. "Something like that." The walkout took 45 minutes. Davidson led, using his own GPS to follow the trail markers. Logan and Hannah walked together, neither speaking much. The forest seemed ordinary now, just trees and moss and the sound of the river. Beautiful, but not threatening. Natural, but not supernatural. At mile 1.7, Logan looked back once. For a moment, in the green distance, he thought he saw a figure standing among the trees. Tall and impossibly thin, crowned with branches, watching them leave with eyes that were knot-hole dark. But when he blinked, there was nothing. Just hemlocks and shadows and the eternal mist. They reached the trailhead at 1:30 p.m. An ambulance waited, along with 3 SAR volunteers and a concerned-looking park superintendent. Hannah was checked over, declared healthy but dehydrated, and taken to Port Angeles for observation. Logan gave his statement. Hiker located alive, no injury, equipment malfunction during search, and filled out the required paperwork. He didn't mention the circles. He didn't mention the spirals. He didn't mention the voice that spoke in rustling leaves. That evening, in his ranger cabin at the park headquarters, Logan opened his notebook. On a fresh page, he wrote, "Emma Chen disappeared Yosemite 2005. Michael Torres disappeared Olympic 2003. E. Johnston disappeared Olympic 1967. Then, after a long moment, he added, Logan Mitchell, Hannah Reeves returned Olympic 2008. Under that, he drew 3 lines radiating from a central point, each ending in a spiral. He stared at it for a long time, thinking about forests and guardians and the price of ignorance. Then he tore the page out, took it outside and burned it, the ash scattered on the wind, carrying into the trees. Some knowledge wasn't meant to be documented. Some experiences couldn't be cataloged. Some places demanded that what happened there stay there, held in the minds of those who survived but never spoken aloud. Logan went back inside and locked the door. But that night, and for many nights after, he dreamed of walking through forests that shifted and spiraled, walking past trees that grew in impossible patterns, walking toward a figure crowned with branches who watched with knot-hole eyes and waited with patience measured in centuries. And in those dreams, sometimes he saw Emma walking too, still moving through some eternal forest, following some endless trail. Not dead but not alive, not lost but not found, suspended in the space between worlds where ancient things kept watch and modern maps meant nothing at all. The Hoh rainforest still stands, receiving its 12 feet of annual rain, growing its 1,000-year-old trees, keeping its secrets. Campsite 12, remains operational. Hannah Reeves never returned to Olympic National Park. Logan Mitchell requested a transfer 6 months later to a desert posting in Utah. Wide open spaces where trees didn't grow in circles and no shadows watched from the green twilight. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he still feels it. The gentle tug of the spiral, the invitation to return, the Leshy's reminder that he was marked now, recognized, and that some forests never truly let go of those who learn their names. The moss hangs thick enough to muffle sound. The trails curve in ways the maps don't show. And somewhere in the space between mile 2, 3, and everywhere else, the guardians keep their watch, patient as stone, old as trees, waiting for the next wanderer who enters without asking and learns, far too late, that some places exact their own price for human ignorance. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The radio crackled at 0647, pulling Rachel Kemper from her third cup of coffee and the incident report she'd been annotating in the margins. Dispatch's voice carried that particular flatness that marked bad news delivered before sunrise. Ranger Kemper, we have a located pack and camera equipment at Cascade Pass. Hiker Christopher Dalton reported overdue 72 hours. Marble Mount Station requesting your response. Rachel set down her red pen, watching the ink bleed slightly into the paper's grain where she'd been circling the words, "No physical evidence of struggle." Her specialization in pattern analysis had made her useful to the North Cascades SR coordinator, though the title felt increasingly hollow. Patterns were supposed to make sense. The 17 cases she'd reviewed in the past 9 months did not. Copy that. ETA 90 minutes. She paused, then added, "What's the condition of the equipment?" "Static, then." "Cameras intact. Last photos are. District Chief wants you to review them on site." Rachel understood the hesitation in the dispatcher's voice. In 2014, after 6 years with the National Park Service, she'd developed an ear for the specific frequency of dread that accompanied genuine anomalies. The kind that didn't fit training manuals or statistical models. She gathered her field pack with practiced efficiency. Garmin eTrex GPS unit fully charged, Motorola two-way with extra batteries, first aid kit, topographic maps of the Cascade Pass trail sector with her own annotations in the margins, elevations, coordinates, previous incident locations marked in different colored inks. Her notebook, dense with observations that would never make it into official reports, and tucked in an interior pocket where it wouldn't show on any equipment manifest, a photocopy of a photocopied page from a German folklore compendium she'd found in a Seattle University library 3 years ago, after her colleague Maya disappeared on the Enchantments Trail. The drive to Marble Mount took 83 minutes through darkness that seemed thicker than it should be for late September. Rachel had stopped questioning these impressions. Her doctorate in statistical psychology had taught her to trust data over intuition, but the forest had taught her that some data didn't translate into spreadsheets. At the trailhead, she met Chief Ranger Douglas Hewitt and Deputy Angela Torres. Hewitt's face had the weathered quality of someone who'd spent 30 years in mountain terrain, but his eyes held something Rachel had seen too often lately, an uncertainty that didn't match his experience level. "The pack was found at 5,400 feet just below the pass," Hewitt said, leading her to an evidence tarp. Tent stakes still in the ground, sleeping bag laid out. No signs of animal activity. Phone was in the pack, dead battery. But the camera? He handed her a Canon EOS Rebel, screen already illuminated to the photo gallery. Rachel scrolled through images of a pleasant enough hike. Morning light through old-growth Douglas fir, a mountain stream, Christopher's boots propped against a boulder, the kind of documentary shots every backpacker took. Then the sequence changed. Photo 047 showed the interior of what appeared to be a structure. Rough-hewn logs, a collapsed roof section, afternoon light streaming through gaps. Photo 048 captured a close-up of something that made Rachel's throat constrict. Pages of a book or journal. The paper aged to near brittleness. Text in Old Germanic script. Photos 049 through 053 showed Christopher's attempts to document the writing. his shadow falling across cramped handwriting and what appeared to be crude diagrams, circles within circles, words she couldn't quite read in the image resolution. Then photo 054 and 055, and 17 more after that. Jesus, Angela whispered, though she must have seen them already. The images showed fog, not weather fog, not the normal condensation of temperature differentials meeting mountain air. This was localized, dense, appearing in Christopher's campsite at what the metadata indicated was 11:23 p.m. The mist formed shapes, suggestions of human outlines, too symmetrical to be pareidolia, too consistent across multiple frames. Photo 072, the last image, showed Christopher's tent from the outside. The fabric bulged inward in 3 places, as if something were pressing against it from within. The timestamp read 03:14 a.m. 47 minutes after that, according to his GPS unit, Christopher had begun walking. The track log showed increasingly erratic movement, circles, backtracking, a pattern that suggested disorientation or pursuit. The GPS signal ended at 04:33 a.m. at coordinates that placed him 2.3 miles northeast of his camp, in terrain that didn't match any established trail. "We've had teams searching since yesterday," Hewitt said. "Found the camera at the campsite, GPS unit in a creek bed, but no Christopher, no tracks beyond a certain point. It's like he gestured vaguely at the mountains. Rachel knew what he meant. 17 cases, 17 variations of just vanished. You said there was a structure in the photos, that cabin or whatever he found." Hewitt's expression shifted. "That's why I called you specifically. Torres and I went looking for it yesterday. Based on his earlier photos, we triangulated the approximate location, found it about a mile southwest of his camp. It's not on any map, not in our database. And Rachel, it shouldn't exist, not in that condition." "Show me," Rachel said. They hiked in as dawn broke over the Cascade Range, turning the glaciated peaks to bleeding rose and gold. Rachel had always loved this hour, the transition between night and day, but lately she'd come to dread it. Something about the way shadows moved in these mountains, the way they seemed to persist past when physics said they should dissolve. The structure appeared suddenly, nestled in a hollow where old-growth hemlocks created a cathedral of shadow. It was small, perhaps 12 by 15 feet, constructed from hand-hewn logs that showed the marks of tools that predated power saws. The roof had partially collapsed, but enough remained to identify it as a frontier-era cabin, the kind settlers might have built in the 1880s or 1890s. But that was impossible. This deep into the park, this high up, there were no records of permanent structures. The North Cascades had been too remote, too severe for casual settlement. Rachel approached slowly, her boots soundless on the thick carpet of hemlock needles. The air around the cabin felt different, denser, as if pressure were building despite the clear sky. Her ears popped. Inside, the space retained the proportions of habitation. A crude hearth, collapsed shelving, the remains of what might have been a bed frame, and on a listing table that somehow still stood, a book. The journal Christopher had photographed. Rachel's hands trembled as she pulled on nitrile gloves and opened to a random page. The German was old-style, formal, the handwriting showing the elaborate capitals of 19th century education. Her German was serviceable, enough to work through technical papers, though this was different. This was vernacular, full of antiquated terms and regional dialect. But certain words stood out. Nuxerer. She'd seen that word before, in the photocopied page she carried. In Maya's notebook, found beside her empty sleeping bag 3 years ago. "What is it?" Angela asked from the doorway. Rachel forced her voice steady. "A journal, dated 1892 if I'm reading this correctly. Someone named Wilhelm Richter." She scanned the pages, her pulse accelerating. "He was here, actually living here. He writes about bringing the necessary texts from Saxony, about the isolation being essential for the working." She turned pages carefully. The entries grew increasingly frantic, the handwriting deteriorating. Wilhelm described nightmares, weight loss, the sensation of being watched. He wrote about hearing sounds in his sleep, a wet, rhythmic noise he couldn't identify. Chewing, he finally concluded, like someone chewing. The final entries were barely legible. Sie kommt jetzt jede Nacht. Ich spüre, wie sie zieht. Die Kraft verlässt meinen Körper. Ich habe das Ritual falsch gemacht. Gott vergib mir. Das Nachzehrer hat mich gefunden. Es nimmt... The writing ended mid-sentence, the pen dragging off the page. Rachel's mouth had gone dry. She flipped back through the journal, finding the pages Christopher had photographed. Diagrams of circles and symbols she recognized from genuine grimoire traditions. Not Hollywood inventions, but actual protective configurations from medieval German occultism. Instructions for a ritual written in a mixture of German and Latin, referencing the binding of something that had died improperly. Rachel? Hewitt's voice seemed to come from very far away. You okay? She wasn't, because she understood now. Wilhelm Richter had come to these mountains to perform a forbidden working, probably thinking the isolation would protect him. He'd been trying to bind something or perhaps summon and control it. A Nachtzehrer. The folklore was specific, documented in texts dating back to the 16th century in German-speaking regions. A Nachtzehrer was a revenant, a corpse that didn't rest properly, typically the result of plague death or suicide. The creature was said to remain conscious in its grave, chewing its burial shroud and clothing, spiritually consuming the life force of living relatives at a distance. As it fed, the living weakened and died. The chewing continued until the Nachtzehrer had consumed everything. Then it would rise from the grave, bloated and terrible. But Richter's ritual hadn't been about binding one. The Latin phrases suggested invocation, summoning. He'd tried to create one, or worse, to become one. We need to search northeast of Christopher's camp, Rachel said, her voice strange in her own ears. The GPS coordinates where his signal stopped. They spent the rest of the day searching. The terrain was brutal. Steep slopes thick with devil's club and slide alder, ancient deadfall creating mazes of rotting timber. Rachel's GPS unit led them to Christopher's last recorded position, a small clearing where the forest opened to expose fractured granite and struggling alpine vegetation. They found nothing. No tracks, no torn clothing, no blood. But as the sun began its descent, Angela called out. She'd discovered something 30 yards downslope, a depression in the earth, perhaps 3 feet wide, bordered by stones that looked deliberately placed. Rachel approached it and felt the pressure change again, that sense of atmosphere thickening. The depression was old, very old. The stones sunk deep into decades of accumulated duff. She brushed away needles and moss, revealing more stones. They formed a circle. "This is a grave," she said, an unmarked grave. Hewitt was already on the radio, calling for additional personnel and excavation equipment. Protocol dictated a formal investigation. But Rachel knew with a certainty that bypassed logic that they wouldn't find Christopher here. They'd find Wilhelm Richter, or what Wilhelm Richter had become. As darkness gathered between the trees, Rachel noticed the fog forming. It began at ground level, wisping up from the depression, thickening with unnatural speed. The temperature hadn't dropped. There was no wind. But the mist rose and coalesced and began to take on that same quality she'd seen in Christopher's photographs. Too purposeful, too organized. "We need to leave," Rachel said. "Now." Hewitt started to protest, but Angela had already seen it. The way the fog moved, the way it seemed to pulse. They descended in near panic, headlamps cutting inadequate tunnels through darkness that pressed close. Rachel's radio spat static. Her GPS unit flickered, coordinates scrambling. Behind them she heard it, a wet, rhythmic sound that her rational mind tried to categorize as wind through trees or water over stones. But it wasn't wind. It wasn't water. It was chewing. They reached the trailhead at 2147. Rachel's legs trembled from exertion and something deeper, something that bypassed muscle and touched marrow. In the parking area's sodium lights, Hewitt's face had gone gray. What the hell was that? Angela's voice cracked on the last word. Rachel couldn't answer. Not yet. Not with the proper words. She needed time to research, to confirm what she suspected. But she knew. The pattern matched. Christopher had found the journal, had perhaps read the ritual words aloud, the kind of mistake someone with no background in occultism might make, thinking they were harmless historical curiosities. He'd activated something, called attention to himself, and the Nachzehrer had begun to feed. Back at her cabin, Rachel couldn't sleep. She spread her research across the table, the photocopies, her notes from 17 cases, printouts from obscure folklore databases she'd accessed through academic accounts she technically shouldn't still have. The laptop screen cast her face in corpse light as she worked through German texts. The Nachzehrer was documented extensively. Methods for identifying them. Check the corpse's mouth and hands for evidence of consumption. Check the burial shroud for chew marks. Methods for stopping them. Place a coin in the mouth. Bind the jaw shut with cloth. Decapitate, and place the head between the legs. Pile stones on the grave. Wilhelm Richter's grave had stones, but not enough. And after 122 years, whatever he'd summoned or become had grown strong. At Maro 233, Rachel's motion sensor porch light activated. She watched through the window as fog pressed against the glass, thicker than any natural mist, moving in ways that suggested intent. Her skin felt wrong, too tight, her energy draining like water from a cracked vessel. She grabbed the photocopy from the German compendium and read the passage again. Das Nachzehrer entzieht den Lebenden die Kraft, bis sie sterben. Dann erhebt es sich vom Grab aufgebläht und schrecklich, direkt zu fressen. The Nachzehrer drains the living of strength until they die. Then it rises from the grave, bloated and terrible, to feed directly. Christopher hadn't just disappeared. He was still dying. Slowly. Wherever he was, if he was still capable of locomotion, he was weakening. His life force being consumed by something that chewed and chewed in its grave, pulling vitality through some connection that transcended physical distance. Rachel's phone showed 3% battery despite being plugged in all day. Her laptop died suddenly, screen going black. The cabin lights flickered. She ran. The night swallowed her as she burst from the cabin, heading for her truck. But the fog was everywhere now, rising from the ground, from the trees, thick and purposeful. It surrounded the vehicle, and when she yanked the door handle, nothing happened. The locks wouldn't respond. The electronic key fob was dead. Behind her, the wet chewing sound grew louder. Rachel's legs gave out. She collapsed onto the gravel, her strength evaporating. This was how it worked. This was how Christopher felt, wherever he was. This was how Maya had felt 3 years ago. This was how 17 people had vanished, drained to husks that the forest consumed, leaving no evidence. The fog parted. Something walked toward her. It had been human once. The rough shape remained, bipedal, approximately 6 feet tall. But the proportions were wrong. The torso was distended, swollen like a tick, and the skin had the waxy translucence of something that had been underground for more than a century. The hands were blackened, the fingernails long and cracked. The face was worst of all. Sunken eyes that still held a terrible awareness, and the mouth, dear God. The mouth was stained dark and working constantly, chewing nothing, chewing air, chewing the invisible threads that connected it to its prey. This was Wilhelm Richter. This was what his failed ritual had created. Not dead enough to rot, not alive enough to be human, trapped in a state of perpetual hunger. Rachel tried to speak, but her voice wouldn't come. Her vision grayed at the edges. The Nachzehrer opened its mouth wider. Its jaw extended with a wet cracking sound. The chewing intensified. She was going to die here. She understood that now. All her research, all her pattern analysis, all her desperate need to understand, it had led her to this, to being prey. But as consciousness began to slip, Rachel's hand found something in her jacket pocket. Not the photocopy. Something else. A small object she'd picked up at the cabin, barely conscious of the action. A stone from Wilhelm's grave. Her fingers closed around it. The fog recoiled slightly. Rachel's mind worked through failing synapses. The stones hadn't just been placed for tradition. They'd been part of the containment. Remove them, weaken the binding. Christopher had disturbed the grave. So had the SAR teams walking over it, disrupting the configuration. With the last of her strength, Rachel threw the stone. Not at the Nachtzehrer. That would accomplish nothing. She threw it toward the forest as far as she could manage, which wasn't far. It landed 15 feet away with a soft thud in the needles. The creature's head snapped toward the sound, its entire body oriented on the stone's new location. For a moment, just a moment, the connection between them loosened. The chewing stopped. Rachel sucked in a breath. The pressure eased fractionally. The Nachtzehrer couldn't stray far from its grave. The folklore was clear on that. It could project its influence, could drain from a distance, but the corpse itself was bound to the burial site. Which meant this thing, this manifestation walking toward her, wasn't the actual body. It was something else. A projection, an echo. But the stone carried dirt from the grave earth. And the creature was drawn to it, to any fragment of its resting place. Rachel forced herself to her knees, then to her feet. Each movement felt like lifting mountains. She staggered to her truck, grabbed her pack from the bed, the one she always kept ready with essential gear. Inside, road flares. She lit one. The magnesium burned bright red, chemical, and angry. The Nachtzehrer turned from the stone, drawn by the light or the heat, or perhaps simply by Rachel's continued consciousness. It began walking toward her again, that swollen body moving with horrible purpose. Rachel dropped the flare and ran. Not away. She didn't have the strength for that. She ran toward her cabin, toward the landline phone that still worked when cell towers failed. She had maybe 30 seconds before the creature reached her again, before it resumed feeding. She dialed a number she'd memorized 3 years ago, after Maya. A professor at University of Washington, specialist in Germanic folklore, the kind of academic who published in obscure journals and understood that some legends had roots in terrible truth. Dr. Kellner, this is Rachel Kemper. I need you to listen carefully. I'm at North Cascades Marble Mount Station. There's an active Nachtzehrer manifestation, late 19th century origin. I have a location on the primary grave. I need you to contact NPS District Chief Hewitt immediately and authorize an emergency excavation. Full protocol, jaw binding, stone replacement, consecrated earth if possible. Tell him it's a historical preservation issue. Tell him whatever you need to tell him. But it has to happen at first light. Rachel, my God, are you... I don't have time. There's a missing hiker, Christopher Dalton. He's still alive but failing. The entity is draining him. If we don't interrupt the connection by properly containing the source corpse, he'll die. Probably within 48 hours. Maybe less. The fog pressed against the windows. The porch light died. Rachel's watch had stopped. I'm calling now, Dr. Kellner said. Rachel, you need to get out of there. If it's active, if it's manifesting, you're in the direct threat zone. I know, Rachel said. I'm aware of that. She hung up and watched through the window as the thing that had been Wilhelm Richter circled her cabin, searching for entry. The chewing sound was constant now, a wet clicking that seemed to come from inside her own head. Rachel's laptop flickered back to life suddenly. The screen showed Christopher's final photo, the tent fabric bulging inward. But now she understood what she was seeing. The Nachtzehrer hadn't been pressing into the tent from inside. It had been pulling at Christopher, pulling his strength, his vitality, his life force through the fabric of reality itself. She opened her field notebook and began writing. If she didn't survive this, someone needed to know. Someone needed to understand the pattern. Case 18, Christopher Dalton, Nachtzehrer manifestation, origin 1892, subject discovered binding site read summoning text, entity established feeding connection. Subject's GPS shows disoriented movement consistent with progressive weakness and mental deterioration. Current status unknown but presumed alive and failing. Agent in field, Rachel Kemper. currently experiencing direct entity contact. Symptoms include extreme fatigue, equipment failure, sensation of draining, auditory manifestation of feeding behavior, containment attempt in progress via traditional folklore protocols. If this report is recovered and I am not, the grave is located at coordinates 485173N, 121.0847W, elevation 5,680 feet. It must be properly sealed. The stones must be replaced. The corpse must be bound. This is not superstition. This is survival. Her hand was shaking so badly she could barely form letters. The fog had found a way in, seeping under the door, through gaps in the window frames. It filled the cabin with that same purposeful density. Rachel stood using the table for support. She wouldn't die sitting down. She wouldn't make it easy. The front door opened, not violently, almost gently. The Nachtsehrer stepped across the threshold. Up close, Rachel could see details she'd missed before. The burial clothes rotted to ribbons but still clinging to the swollen body. The hands that had torn through earth and wood to reach the surface. The mouth that never stopped working, grinding nothing, consuming everything. "Wilhelm," Rachel said. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Wilhelm Richter, you made a mistake. You tried to become something you weren't meant to be. And it trapped you. All these years, all this hunger, it won't stop, it will never stop. Is that what you wanted?" The creature paused. Something flickered in those sunken eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or the ghost of understanding. For just a moment, the chewing slowed. Rachel pressed on, though each word cost her. "You can end this. You can rest. Let them find you. Let them give you peace." But whatever humanity had flickered, there was gone. The mouth opened wider. The chewing resumed with renewed vigor. Rachel's legs buckled. She went down hard, her head striking the floor. Pain bloomed but felt distant, unimportant. The ceiling tiles wavered and blurred. This is it, she thought. This is how it ends. Drained dry by something that should have stayed buried. Her research incomplete. Christopher still missing. Another name added to the pattern. The last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the fog thickening, and within it, other shapes. Thinner shapes. Desperate shapes. The others it had taken over 122 years. Maya's face among them. All of them trapped in the Nachtsehren's perpetual hunger, unable to pass on, unable to rest. Then darkness claimed her. Rachel woke to voices and daylight stabbing through her windows. Her body felt hollowed out, fragile as paper. EMT personnel moved around her cabin. When had they arrived? How much time had passed? Responsive now, pupils equal and reactive. Massive dehydration, possible exposure. No physical trauma evident, but... Angela Torres leaned into her field of view. "Rachel, Jesus Christ, we've been trying to reach you for 6 hours. Your phone was dead, your radio. Everything was dead. We finally just drove up here and found you on the floor." Rachel's throat felt lined with sand. "The grave," she managed. "Did Kellner..." "Dr. Kellner called Hewitt at 5 a.m., Angela said. "They're up there now with an excavation team. Found remains matching 19th century burial. They're following some kind of protocol," he specified. "Rachel, what the hell happened?" Before she could answer, Hewitt's voice crackled over Angela's radio. "Torres, you need to hear this. We found him. We found Christopher Dalton." Rachel struggled to sit up despite the EMT's protests. "Where?" 3.2 miles from his last GPS position. He just walked into our search perimeter 20 minutes ago. He's alive but in bad shape. Severe dehydration, disoriented, massive weight loss. Says he's been walking for 3 days but can't remember where he was going or why. It's like he was sleepwalking the whole time. 3 days of walking while something fed on him from a distance. 3 days of being drained, but he'd survived, because someone had interrupted the connection. Over the next week, as Rachel slowly recovered, the pieces came together. The excavation team had found Wilhelm Richter's corpse in remarkable preservation. Too remarkable, the county medical examiner noted uneasily. The jaw had been working, grinding. The burial shroud showed extensive chewing damage. When they'd replaced the protective stones properly, weighted the grave correctly, and, following Dr. Kellner's very specific instructions, bound the jaw with iron wire blessed by a Lutheran minister, the faith Richter would have known, something changed. Christopher began improving immediately. Within hours, his mental clarity returned. Within days, his physical strength started rebuilding. He remembered finding the cabin, reading passages aloud from the journal, thinking they were just historical curiosities. He remembered feeling increasingly tired, increasingly lost. He remembered walking and walking, unable to stop, pulled by something he couldn't name. He didn't remember the fog, didn't remember any manifestation. The mind, Rachel reflected, had protective mechanisms. Sometimes forgetting was a kindness, but Rachel remembered. She would always remember. She returned to the grave site 6 weeks later, alone. The excavation had been covered over, the stones replaced and supplemented with several tons of additional rock. A small historical marker had been placed nearby. Pioneer grave, C, 1892, name unknown. The official story was that Wilhelm Richter had been a hermit who died of exposure and malnutrition. His journal was catalogued as a historical artifact, though certain pages had been removed for preservation purposes. Rachel knew better. Dr. Kellner had those pages. They would never see public access. She stood at the grave as October rain began to fall, cold and clean. The forest felt different here now, still watchful, still heavy with presence, but contained. Bound. The chewing had stopped. Rachel pulled out her field notebook and added a final note to Case 18. Subject Christopher Dalton recovered alive. Entity successfully contained through traditional folklore protocols. Threat level, neutralized, but location requires permanent monitoring. Recommend site remain restricted. Pattern analysis. This makes 18 confirmed cases. Only one survivor. I have been tracking these manifestations for 3 years. I have identified 23 additional sites that show similar characteristics. The North Cascades alone may contain a dozen more. Some doors, once opened, never fully close. Some rituals, once begun, echo across centuries. We walk through forests built on graves we don't see, carrying stones we don't understand. I will continue documenting. Someone has to know. Someone has to recognize the patterns before more people vanish into the spaces between the living and the dead, consumed by hunger that never stops, never ends. Below that, in smaller letters, Rachel added one more line, not for any report, just for herself. Maya, I understand now. I'm sorry I couldn't before. I hope you found rest. She closed the notebook and walked back down the trail. Behind her, the grave settled under its burden of stones, and in the spaces between the rain, the forest was silent. But Rachel knew silence wasn't the same as peace. It never had been. Some things once awakened only slept. They never truly died. They waited in the dark soil, chewing, always chewing, patient as stone and twice as hungry. That night, in her cabin, Rachel's equipment came back to life. Phone, laptop, GPS, all fully charged, all functioning normally. She opened her research files and began documenting the next location. The pattern was becoming clearer. Somewhere in the mountains, fog was gathering. Somewhere, a hiker would stray from the trail. Somewhere something waited in the earth, ready to pull and drain and consume. But now Rachel knew how to stop it. One grave at a time. One ritual at a time. One pattern solved and documented and contained. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the darkness, against the hunger, it was something. She picked up her red pen and began to write. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened. The radio crackled at 6:47 a.m., pulling David Morrison from his second cup of coffee. Static, then dispatch. Range 4, we have a code yellow. Solo hiker 4 days overdue. Last known, Belly River sector. Dave set down his mug, the ceramic meeting wood with a sound too loud for the quiet morning. 18 years with the National Park Service had taught him that the phrase, 4 days overdue, carried weight that couldn't be measured in hours alone. In Glacier's backcountry, 4 days meant hypothermia, bear encounters, cliff falls, a litany of disasters he'd seen firsthand. But it also meant something else, something he'd learned not to articulate in official reports, that the wilderness had already decided. Copy that. Subject details? He was already reaching for his gear vest, mentally cataloging what he'd need. July in Glacier meant unpredictable weather, even in the valleys. Up near Belly River, where the terrain pushed against the Canadian border, temperatures could drop 30 degrees after sunset. Jessica Hartley, 29, solo permit for cultural research, anthropology PhD candidate from University of Montana. Last check-in was Thursday, so 900 hours from Many Glacier Ranger Station. Planned route, Belly River Trail to Elizabeth Lake. Estimated return yesterday. Dave paused. Cultural research. That usually meant rock art documentation, sometimes archaeological surveys of old Blackfeet sites. The university coordinated those permits carefully, always with safety protocols. A PhD candidate would know the risks, would carry proper gear. 4 days overdue wasn't panic yet, but it wasn't routine either. I'll head out within the hour. Alert SAR Team Charlie for possible mobilization. 10 to 4, range 4. Subject's vehicle located at trailhead. Keys inside, doors unlocked. That detail lodged in Dave's mind as he loaded his pack. Doors unlocked, keys inside. People didn't abandon security measures without reason, either extreme confidence or extreme haste. He added extra water purification tablets, backup GPS batteries, and his personal Garmin E-Trex that had never failed him. The park-issued Motorola radio went on his belt, already set to Channel 7 for SAR coordination. The drive to Belly River Trailhead took 40 minutes, the early light turning the peaks of the Lewis Range into stark silhouettes. Dave had worked this sector for 6 years, knew its moods. The Blackfeet called it the backbone of the world, and on mornings like this he understood why. The landscape held a quality of permanence that made human concerns feel temporary, negotiable. Jessica Hartley's vehicle sat alone in the gravel lot, a green Subaru Outback with Montana plates and university parking stickers. Dave photographed it with his digital Canon, noting the timestamp, 0743. Inside, exactly as reported, keys in the ignition, doors unlocked. A water bottle in the cup holder, still a quarter full. Granola bar wrappers in the console, normal trail prep debris. But the back seat made him pause. 3 hardcover books lay scattered across the upholstery. Algonquian Oral Traditions of the Northern Plains. Wendigo Psychosis, a study of relationship between belief and behavior. And Dark Shamans, transformation narratives in native North American cultures. Post-it notes bristled from the pages like neon feathers. Dave picked up the first book carefully, flipping to a marked section. Handwritten marginalia in tight academic script. Connection to starvation winters of 1883-84. Check Blackfeet oral histories. The second book fell open to a chapter titled The Hunger That Walks. More notes, these more frantic. Not metaphor, literal transformation. Accounts too consistent across tribes. Cree, Ojibwe, Algonquin, all describe same physical changes. Dave set the books back, uneasy in a way he couldn't immediately categorize. Anthropologists studied myths. That was their job, nothing unusual about research materials. But the progression of those notes from academic curiosity to something approaching urgency suggested Jessica Hartley had found something that had excited or disturbed her enough to accelerate her timeline. He locked the Subaru, pocketing the keys. Standard procedure. Secure the vehicle, document the scene. The trailhead register showed her signature from 4 days ago, exactly as dispatch had reported. J. Hartley Solo, Elizabeth Lake via Belly River, returned 7 to 2209. Her handwriting was controlled, confident. The entry before hers was from 2 days prior, A family from Wisconsin, day hike only. The trail began innocently enough. Lodgepole pines thick on both sides, the path well maintained and clearly marked. Dave moved at his SAR pace, steady, sustainable, eyes scanning for any deviation from the norm. Broken branches, disturbed soil, anything out of place. The morning was cool, temperature around 52 degrees according to his thermometer. Perfect hiking weather. At mile 3, he found the first anomaly. A cairn stood beside the trail, but not the official NPS markers. This was personal construction. 5 stones stacked with deliberate care, and beside it, scratched into the dirt, a single word: hungry. Dave photographed it, then studied the surrounding area. No footprints clearly visible. The trail here was mostly exposed rock, but someone had stopped, taken time to build this marker to leave this message. He pulled out his notebook, documenting time, location, exact GPS coordinates: 489234 degree N, 113.6789 degree Bu. The word bothered him. Not help or lost or even hurt, just hungry. He continued, and the forest began to change. It was subtle at first. The bird calls that had accompanied his first miles grew sparse, then silent. The sun, which should have been climbing toward its July zenith, seemed filtered through something Dave couldn't identify. The light took on a quality he'd only seen before winter storms, flat and shadowless. His thermometer read 49 degrees. The temperature was dropping. At mile 5, he found Jessica's first camp. The tent was still erect, a 2-person MSR hubba-hubba in teal and gray, but the fly had been torn, not ripped by wind or animal, but opened from inside. The zipper teeth bent backward as if something had forced its way out in desperate haste. Dave approached carefully, calling out, "Jessica Hartley, National Park Service, if you can hear me, please respond." Silence. The kind that pressed against eardrums. Inside the tent, organized chaos. Sleeping bag half unzipped. Headlamp still on, batteries dead, the beam a faint orange. Food bag hanging from the tent's apex. Proper bear protocol, he noted with approval. But when he opened it, he found something that made his professional calm flicker. Every food item had been partially consumed, then carefully rewrapped. Granola bars with single bites taken, half a packet of trail mix, a protein bar with teeth marks that looked almost frantic, multiple bites clustered together, as if the eater couldn't decide whether to devour or reject. Her backpack lay open beside the sleeping bag. Dave inventoried the contents: extra clothing, neatly rolled, first aid kit, untouched, water filter, still in its stuff sack, and at the bottom, wrapped in a waterproof map case, a journal. He should have waited, should have bagged it as evidence, documented it undisturbed. But 18 years of search and rescue had taught him that context mattered, and context meant understanding the subject's state of mind. Dave opened the journal. The first entries were exactly what he'd expected: academic observations written in neat block letters. Jessica had spent her first day hiking to this campsite, documenting what she called spatial folklore patterns, how Blackfeet stories about specific locations correlated with geographical features. She'd found evidence of old Vision Quest sites, noted the presence of certain plants used in traditional ceremonies. Professional, methodical. Then the entry from 3 days ago. Found something I shouldn't have, not on any cultural survey map. GPS, 489456 degree N, 11370 degree W. Circle of stones, but not natural, arranged. And in the center, bones. Recent enough that I could identify elk, mountain goat, and something else. Too large for deer, wrong structure for bear. The local Blackfeet elder I interviewed last month, Thomas Heavy Runner, warned me about this area. Said it was hungry ground. I thought it was metaphorical. Now I'm not sure. The bones in the center were arranged in a pattern, spiral moving inward, like something was drawing prey in. I took photos, samples, should probably leave, but this could validate the entire theory about ritualistic sites. One more day. Dave's unease crystallized into something sharper. He pulled out his own GPS, noted the coordinates she'd written. About 3 miles northeast of this camp, up toward the ridgeline where the trail forked toward Elizabeth Lake. The next entry was written in shakier script. Couldn't sleep. Too cold. My thermometer says 38 degrees, but it's July. That's impossible at this elevation. Keep hearing something outside the tent. Not animal sounds, words, or something approximating words. Algonquian? I studied Cree dialects, and this sounds similar but wrong. The vowels are elongated, like someone learning to speak for the first time. It keeps saying something that sounds like Wedikow. That word, the one from the books, Wendigo. But that's not possible because Wendigo is mythological construct, cultural metaphor for the dangers of isolation and greed. It's not real. I'm hallucinating from altitude or dehydration. Need to stay rational. Morning, I'll head down, file my reports, get proper sleep. The handwriting there, the repeated underlines, the way certain letters pressed hard enough to tear the paper, spoke to fear fighting against training. Jessica Hartley was trying to explain away what was happening using the academic frameworks that had brought her here. The final entry made Dave's hands go numb. It's not hallucination. I saw it. 3 a.m., moon almost full, and I needed to pee. Went outside, away from tent, and it was standing there, 30 yards away. At first I thought grizzly. The size was right. But then it moved, and grizzlies don't move like that. Too fast. Too deliberate. And the shape was wrong. Bipedal, but hunched. Limbs too long. And the face, God, the face. Lipless. Teeth visible even in moonlight. Too many teeth. And the eyes, not reflecting light, absorbing it. Black holes where eyes should be. It spoke again. Widikau ka pako seyitam. I know enough Cree to translate. The Wendigo is hungry. Then it smiled. A smile shouldn't look like that. Like someone remembering what joy used to feel like but getting the expression completely wrong. I ran. Left everything. Running now. If someone finds this, the stories are true. The Blackfeet elders weren't speaking metaphorically. There's something in these mountains that shouldn't exist. And it knows I'm here. That was the last entry. Dave stood slowly, the journal still in his hands. Every rational instinct screamed explanations. Hypothermia could cause hallucinations. Sleep deprivation produced paranoid delusions. 4 days alone in wilderness amplified fear responses. Jessica Hartley had psyched herself out researching dark folklore, had probably encountered a bear in poor lighting, had panicked and run. Except the temperature had been dropping all morning, and it was now, he checked his thermometer again, 43 degrees in July, at an elevation where it should be pushing 70 by now. Except the silence. In 18 years, he'd never experienced silence like this. No insect hum, no bird calls, not even wind through the pines, except the way the food had been partially eaten, as if the eater kept trying to satisfy something that couldn't be satisfied. Dave keyed his radio. Range 4 to dispatch. Found subject's campsite at coordinates 48.9234 degree on, 113.6789 degree I. Tent abandoned. Signs of rapid departure. Requesting immediate SAR mobilization, full team. Subject may be experiencing medical emergency. Over. Static. Then more static. He checked the radio. Battery full. Channel correct. But no response. Range 4 to dispatch. Do you copy? Over. Nothing. Dave tried his cell phone, already knowing what he'd find. No signal. Standard for this area. The terrain made cellular coverage sporadic at best. But the radio should work. Motorola XTS 5000, designed for exactly this kind of situation, with 20-watt output and repeater access. It should work. He was about to try again when he heard it. From up the trail, toward the coordinates Jessica had written, came a sound that made him question everything he thought he knew about animal vocalization. It started low, subsonic almost, felt more than heard. Then it rose, modulating through frequencies that seemed designed to trigger primal fear responses. Not a howl, not a roar. Something between speech and hunger, as if something was learning to use vocal cords for the first time, and the result was fundamentally wrong. Then clear in the silence that followed. Note Hawaii, Cree word. Dave didn't speak the language, but he'd worked with Blackfeet Rangers who did. Translated roughly to, listen. His hands were shaking. Dave Morrison, 18 years of experience, decorated for valor during a 2004 rescue in avalanche conditions, was shaking. Because that sound hadn't come from an animal, he made a decision that violated every protocol he'd spent his career upholding. He was going to find Jessica Hartley, and then they were both leaving this mountain. Immediately. Helicopter extraction if necessary. Explanations could come later, after they were somewhere with working radios and July temperatures that didn't dip into the 40s. Dave shouldered his pack, secured Jessica's journal in a pocket, and started toward the coordinates she'd documented. The trail forked ahead, one path continuing toward Elizabeth Lake, the other, older, less maintained, cutting northeast into timber. He took the northeast fork. The temperature continued dropping. At 41 degrees, Dave stopped to add a layer. As he pulled the fleece from his pack, he noticed something that made his already heightened anxiety spike into something approaching terror. His breath was visible. White vapor in July air. He forced himself to keep moving. The fork narrowed, became less trail than game path. Branches scraped against his jacket. The light, that strange flat quality, made distance difficult to judge. Trees that should have been 20 feet away looked close enough to touch, while obstacles right in front of him appeared farther than they were. The circle appeared exactly where Jessica's coordinates placed it, 20 feet in diameter, perfectly round, lined with stones that Dave immediately recognized as non-native, quartzite, probably from the creek beds miles below. Someone had carried these stones here, arranged them with purpose, and in the center, exactly as Jessica had described, bones. Dave approached carefully, camera ready, professional documentation, even as his mind screamed at him to run. The bones were arranged in a spiral pattern, starting with small mammal remains on the outer edge, rabbits, marmots, squirrels, then progressing inward through larger species. Elk, mountain goat, bighorn sheep. And in the very center, something that Dave's 18 years of wilderness experience couldn't immediately identify. Too large for any predator in this region. Wrong joint structure. The skull, the skull, had eye sockets positioned slightly too far forward, and the jaw extended 6 inches beyond what anatomy should allow. He was photographing this, hands surprisingly steady now that training had overridden fear, when he heard the second sound. Breathing, heavy, wet, as if each inhalation pulled through damaged lungs, coming from behind him. Dave turned slowly. 30 yards away, standing at the edge of the tree line, was something his mind refused to properly process. His eyes registered details: height around 7 feet, humanoid structure but elongated, skin that looked gray and desiccated. But his brain kept trying to categorize it as bear, as elk, as anything that fit within known parameters. Then it smiled. Jessica had been right. The expression was wrong because the entity wearing it remembered smiles from some distant past but had forgotten what they meant. Lipless mouth stretching too wide, revealing teeth that looked filed to points. And the eyes. Not black holes as Jessica had described. She'd been viewing it in moonlight. In daylight, Dave could see they were there, but wrong. Yellowed sclera around pupils that didn't dilate or contract, didn't respond to light. Dead eyes in a face that moved. It spoke. Ko no tawina. The words came out slowly, as if the entity was testing each syllable. Dave's translator app wouldn't work without signal, but the tone was clear. A question. Did you listen? Dave's training finally caught up with his terror. Bear protocol. Make yourself large, back away slowly, don't run. But this wasn't a bear, and every instinct screamed that normal protocols were not just insufficient but actively dangerous. He reached slowly for his bear spray, the only weapon he carried. The entity's head tilted bird-like, tracking the movement. Then it laughed. The sound made Dave's teeth ache, resonating at a frequency that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly in his skull. Pi wapiskos, it said. Useless metal. It spoke English now, or something approximating English, the accent wrong in ways Dave couldn't articulate. "Where is Jessica Hartley?" Dave forced the words out, surprised by how steady his voice sounded. The entity's smile widened. "The woman who reads the old words. She is learning. As you will learn." It took a step forward. The movement was wrong. Joints bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. Weight distribution that defied biomechanics. Like something wearing a human shape but forgetting the small details that made that shape work. Dave sprayed. The chemical stream hit the entity directly in the face at 15 feet, a shot that should have sent any bear running. Instead, the creature paused, head tilting again, as if considering this new sensation. Then it continued forward, pace unchanged. Dave ran. He'd broken the cardinal rule, the thing they taught in every wilderness safety course: never run from a predator. But this wasn't a predator in any sense that word held meaning. This was something else, something that Jessica's research had been correct about, something that the Blackfeet elders' warnings had tried to convey. Behind him, the sound of pursuit. Not running, something faster. Movement that shouldn't be possible through dense forest, as if the entity could flow through obstacles rather than navigate around them. Dave's GPS showed he was heading roughly southwest, back toward the main trail. If he could reach Jessica's camp, her tent. Illogical thinking, tents provided no protection, but his mind was fragmenting, searching for any psychological anchor. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees. Frost formed on the branches beside him as he ran, in July. He burst into Jessica's campsite and nearly collided with her. She stood beside the collapsed tent, wearing only a thermal top and hiking pants, no jacket despite the impossible cold. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin that looked gray. Her lips moved constantly, muttering something in a language Dave didn't know. Jessica Hartley. I'm with the National Park Service. We need to go now." She turned to look at him, and Dave saw her eyes. Not fully transformed, not yet. Still human brown, but the pupils had begun to elongate, to shift into something else. And in them, a hunger that made his stomach clench. Not the hunger of someone who'd skipped meals, the hunger of someone who'd consumed everything available and found it insufficient. The hunger that would never stop. "You don't understand," she said, her voice hoarse. "I found it, the source. The transformation isn't mythological, it's evolutionary. A survival adaptation triggered by extreme starvation that rewrites human neurology and physiology. The Blackfeet documented it for generations, but anthropologists dismissed it as cultural metaphor because we couldn't conceive of something that violated our biological models." She took a step toward him, and Dave noticed her hands. The fingernails had lengthened, thickened, become more claw than nail. The joints looked swollen, as if the bones underneath were pushing against skin, testing its limits. "The hunger starts small," Jessica continued, and now her voice held an edge of hysteria fighting against academic precision. "Just normal appetite. But then it grows, becomes all you can think about. Food doesn't help. I ate everything, Dave. Everything in my pack. Tried grass, tree bark, anything. Nothing stops it. Because it's not food the hunger wants. It's something else. Something..." She stopped, head jerking toward the tree line where Dave had emerged. Then she smiled, and the expression was beginning to match the entities that remembered motion, emptied of meaning. "It's calling me," she whispered. "Can't you hear it? The invitation. Join us. Stop fighting. Let the hunger win." "No." Dave grabbed her arm. Mistake. Immediate mistake. Her skin was cold, corpse cold, and beneath it, he could feel things moving that shouldn't move. "We're leaving. Both of us. Right now." She looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face, and for a moment something human surfaced in her eyes. Terror, grief, apology. "Too late for me, but you..." "Run, Dave. It gave me a choice 4 days ago. I made the wrong one. Don't make my mistake." Behind her, emerging from the tree line, came the entity Dave had encountered, and beside it, two more. Taller, older-looking if such terms applied. Their faces held less human resemblance, as if time had worn away the last pretense of what they'd been. The central figure, the one Dave had first seen, spoke again. The woman made her choice. She sought knowledge of hunger. Now she understands. Soon she becomes. The transformation takes days, as the old flesh resists. But flesh always yields to hunger. Hunger is truth. Hunger is eternal. Jessica pulled away from Dave, moving toward the entities with stumbling steps. "I'm sorry," she said, not looking back. "Tell Thomas Heavy Runner he was right. Tell the university that some research shouldn't be pursued. Tell my mother." Her voice broke. "Tell her I'm sorry." Dave's mind presented him with two options. Try to physically restrain Jessica Hartley and die attempting it, or run, and maybe survive to warn others. He ran. This time, nothing pursued. Behind him, he heard Jessica's scream. Pain and ecstasy and transformation mixed into something that would haunt him forever. Then that sound cut off, replaced by silence. No, not silence. Laughter. Multiple voices layered, finding something amusing in his flight. Dave ran for 3 hours, checking his GPS obsessively, taking every shortcut his experience suggested. The temperature began climbing around mile 8, 40 degrees, then 50, then finally back to the normal July warmth. Bird calls returned. The light lost that flat winter storm quality. At mile 10, his radio crackled to life. "Range 4, dispatch. We've lost contact for 4 hours. What's your status? Over." Dave stopped, hands on knees, sucking air. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then, "Dispatch, Range 4. Subject located but unrecoverable. Requesting immediate helicopter extraction. Coordinates to follow. Advise all personnel to avoid Belly River sector until further notice. Over. Range 4. Clarify unrecoverable. Is subject deceased? Over." Dave looked back the way he'd come. The trail behind him looked normal. Just wilderness, beautiful and indifferent. Negative, dispatch. Subject is, no longer requires rescue. Will provide full report upon extraction. Range 4 out. He didn't try to explain more. Some things couldn't be conveyed over radio. The helicopter arrived 90 minutes later, touching down in the small clearing near Many Glacier Ranger Station. Dave climbed aboard, and as they lifted off, he looked down at the vast wilderness of Glacier National Park spreading below. Millions of acres, hundreds of miles of trails, and somewhere in there, the Belly River sector, where something that science refused to acknowledge was teaching a woman named Jessica Hartley the true meaning of hunger. The park superintendent met him at the landing zone. Dave handed over Jessica's journal, still in its waterproof case. "She went hypothermic," he said, the lie forming easily. "Hallucinations, paranoid delusions. Ran from her camp before I could reach her. The terrain up there, too many places to fall, to get hurt. I searched for hours but lost her trail. Recommend full SR mobilization at first light." The superintendent nodded, already reading the journal. "Says here she found something, some kind of stone circle, bones arranged." "Hypothermia," Dave repeated. "Makes people believe things that aren't real." That night in his small apartment in West Glacier, Dave couldn't sleep. His thermometer read 74 degrees, normal summer warmth, but he kept his window closed, locked, curtains drawn. Because twice, just after midnight, he'd heard something outside. Not scratching, not knocking, just breathing. Patient, wet breathing. And once, so faint he almost convinced himself he'd imagined it. "Kagchia no Tawin na." Did you listen? The SAR team went out the next morning. They found Jessica's camp, her tent, her abandoned gear. They found the stone circle, photographed it, documented everything. The bones in the center were sent to the State Wildlife Laboratory for analysis. The report came back 2 weeks later. Elk, mountain goat, black bear, and one species they couldn't identify. The DNA didn't match any known mammal in their database. Further analysis recommended. Jessica Hartley was officially listed as missing, presumed dead, though her body was never recovered. The case remained open. Dave provided testimony, sanitized, professional, making no mention of entities or transformations or the impossible cold. Just hypothermia, hallucinations, a woman lost to wilderness. He requested transfer to a different park. Yellowstone took him, and he served there for 3 more years before retiring early. Never went into deep wilderness again if he could avoid it. Stayed on the tourist trails, the maintained loops, places where crowds and civilization kept the shadows at bay. But sometimes, on quiet nights, he pulled out a photocopy he'd made of Jessica's journal. One particular passage, written in her neat academic hand before the fear took over. Thomas Heavyrunner told me that the Wendigo is not just a creature but a warning about what humans become when we let hunger consume us. Not physical hunger, he said. Hunger for knowledge, for power, for things we shouldn't want. Once that hunger takes root, it transforms us, makes us into something that can never be satisfied. The Algonquian peoples understood this. They created the Wendigo stories not as entertainment, but as cultural safeguard, warning against the dangers of insatiable appetite in a world of limited resources. She'd been right, Dave thought. The stories weren't metaphor. They were documentation, centuries of warnings about something real. His thermometer read 73 degrees, but Dave still kept his window closed, because some hungers, once awakened, never sleep. They just wait, patient in the deep places, for the next person curious enough or desperate enough or foolish enough to listen when they call. And somewhere in the Belly River sector of Glacier National Park, where the Blackfeet once held their vision quests and the old warnings still echoed through the pines, something waited in a circle of stones, growing stronger, growing hungrier, teaching the lesson that Jessica Hartley had learned too late. Some knowledge comes with a price that devours everything you are and everything you'll ever be. And once paid, that price can never be refunded. The hunger is patient. The hunger is eternal. The hunger is always listening. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened to Jessica. Christopher Dalton had spent 11 years with the Bureau of Land Management, and in that time, he'd learned that most mysteries in the backcountry had mundane explanations. Missing hikers turned up dehydrated but alive. Strange sounds were coyotes or wind through sandstone formations. Unexplained footprints belonged to mule deer or feral horses. He'd built his reputation on methodical analysis, on reading landscapes the way others read books, on finding the logical thread that connected evidence to explanation. That Tuesday morning in late September 2015, standing at the trailhead where Hole in the Rock Road met the Coyote Gulch access point, Chris reviewed the case file on his tablet one more time before the battery died. Sarah Mitchell, 21, University of Arizona anthropology student, had obtained a backcountry permit for a 5-day solo research trip. She was studying contemporary Navajo folklore and its intersection with Ute traditions in the Grand Staircase Escalante region. Her faculty advisor had described her as meticulous, experienced, and safety conscious. She was supposed to check in via satellite phone every evening at 7. The last check-in had been 73 hours ago. Chris switched off the tablet and stowed it in his pack, then performed his equipment check with practiced efficiency. Garmin GPS map 60 forced with fully charged batteries and backup AAs. Motorola two-way radio, though he knew from experience the canyons would limit its range to maybe a mile optimistically. First aid kit, water filtration system, emergency bivvy, flares. His service weapon, a Glock 22, though he couldn't imagine what use it would be against dehydration or a broken ankle. Everything in its place, everything accounted for, everything rational. The temperature was already pushing 85 degrees, unusual for late September, and the sky held that particular quality of blue that seemed painted on. Not a cloud anywhere. The Weather Service predicted clear conditions for the next 48 hours, which was both good and concerning. Good because it meant no flash floods. Concerning because Sarah had now missed 3 check-ins, and if she was injured, the heat would accelerate everything bad. Chris had read her research proposal the night before. She'd been investigating local variations of the Yinald Lushi legends, the stories about witches who wore animal skins and violated the deepest taboos of Navajo culture. Chris knew the basics. Most park rangers in the Southwest did. Skinwalkers, as Anglo culture had incorrectly but persistently named them, were supposed to be witches who gained the ability to transform into animals through forbidden rituals. The legends were taken seriously enough by some communities that mentioning them directly was considered dangerous. Sarah's proposal had been academic and respectful, focused on how these stories had evolved and spread beyond their origins in Navajo tradition. Chris shouldered his pack and started down the trail. The path wound through juniper and sage for the first mile, following a gradually descending ridge that would eventually drop into the upper reaches of Coyote Gulch. Sarah's permit had specified a campsite near the confluence where Coyote Creek met the Escalante River, about 15 miles in. Chris had covered this territory dozens of times. He knew every switchback, every seasonal spring, every place where the sandstone formed natural cisterns that held rainwater. What he found 2 hours later made no sense. Sarah's camp was exactly where her permit said it would be, tucked into an alcove beneath a sweeping overhang of Navajo sandstone. Her tent was still standing, properly staked, rainfly secured, even though no rain had fallen in 3 weeks. Her bear canister sat 20 yards from the tent, unopened. A small ring of rocks contained the cold remains of a campfire. Her boots, expensive Asolos, barely broken in, sat neatly outside the tent entrance. Chris stood at the edge of the camp for a full minute, his training warring with the wrongness of the scene. People didn't leave their camps barefoot. People didn't walk away from their gear, their food, their water. He approached slowly, calling out her name, though he knew she wasn't here. The silence that answered him had texture, had weight. He photographed everything before he touched anything, documentation ingrained in him through years of search and rescue operations. Then he opened the tent. Sarah's sleeping bag was unzipped and pushed to one side. Her satellite phone sat on top of her pack, battery dead. Her journal lay open beside the sleeping bag, a pen resting in the crease between pages. Chris picked up the journal carefully, aware that he might be handling evidence. The last entry was dated 3 days ago, the evening of her final check-in. The handwriting was neat, controlled, academic. Day 3. Interviewed RM. Name withheld per IRB protocol, at trading post in Escalante. He was initially reluctant, but eventually shared a story his grandfather told him about a man from his mother's clan who was suspected of practicing the forbidden magic. The specifics aligned with what Dr. Yazzie mentioned: the use of corpse powder, the violation of kinship taboos, the night hunts. RM became visibly uncomfortable when I asked about physical evidence or contemporary sightings. He said some things should not be invited by speaking them. He asked if I was camping alone. When I said yes, he told me to keep my fire burning all night and not to answer if I heard voices in the dark. He seemed genuinely concerned. I assured him I would be careful. The hike to the campsite was uneventful. Set up camp at 4:30 p.m. The alcove provides good shelter and the water source is clean. I'm positioned where the side canyon meets the main gulch, exactly as planned. 7 p.m. check-in completed. Clear skies, temperature dropping comfortably. I keep thinking about what RM said about not answering voices. It's interesting how these warnings... The entry stopped mid-sentence. Chris turned the page. The next page was blank, except for a single sentence written in the same handwriting but with a different pen. The letters larger, more forceful. The tracks change. Below this, Sarah had drawn something. It took Chris a moment to understand what he was looking at. She'd sketched a series of footprints, each one carefully detailed. The first was clearly a bare human foot, 5 toes, arch, heel. The second showed the foot elongating, the toes spreading. The third showed the foot narrowing, the toes fusing. The fourth, was a coyote's paw print. Chris felt something cold settle in his stomach, though his rational mind immediately began constructing explanations. She'd seen an animal that happened to step in her own footprints. She'd been drawing illustrations for her research. She'd been half asleep and misinterpreted what she saw in poor light. He set the journal down and conducted a thorough search of the tent. Her clothes were neatly folded. Her research materials were organized. Her toiletries were untouched. Everything suggested someone who'd simply stood up and walked away, except for the boots, except for the satellite phone, except for that drawing. Chris emerged from the tent and began a careful survey of the surrounding area, moving in expanding circles, reading the ground. The sand near the creek held tracks, Sarah's, from her hiking boots, several sets crossing and recrossing as she'd gone to filter water. There were also coyote tracks, which wasn't unusual. Coyotes were everywhere in the backcountry. But then he found the other prints. They started at the edge of the fire pit, as if something had approached while Sarah sat by the flames. They were bare human footprints, smaller than Chris's, probably about Sarah's size. They led away from the camp, heading up the side canyon. Chris followed them, his Garmin tracking his route, his mind working through the possibilities. Maybe she'd removed her boots for some reason. Maybe she'd met another hiker. Maybe. The footprints changed. It happened over the course of about 10 yards. The human prints began to look wrong. The toes too long, the arch collapsing. Then they weren't quite human anymore. Then they were definitely animal. Coyote, Chris's training told him, even as another part of his brain rejected what his eyes were showing him. Coyote tracks continuing up the canyon, the same direction the human prints had been going. Chris stood there in the growing heat, his shadow a sharp knife on the sand, and felt the careful architecture of his rationality begin to shift. There had to be an explanation, two different trails overlapping, an optical illusion created by wind erosion. His mind was supplying answers, but none of them fit what he was seeing. He followed the coyote tracks for another 100 yards. They wound up the narrow side canyon, staying in the softer sand where they remained clearly visible. Then they stopped at a flat section of rock and didn't continue on the other side. Chris searched for 20 minutes, examining every inch of surrounding ground, but the tracks simply ended. When he returned to Sarah's camp, his radio crackled to life, startling him. "Base to Dalton. Come in." He keyed the transmit button. "Dalton here. Status report on the Mitchell search? Found her camp. Fully intact, all gear present. No sign of the subject. Tracks are..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Inconclusive. I'm going to continue searching the immediate area. Copy that. Weather update. High pressure system stalling out. Clear skies through Friday. Temps climbing to low 90s tomorrow." "Understood. Dalton out." Chris spent the next 2 hours conducting a systematic search of every accessible area within a mile radius of the camp. He found nothing. No clothing, no blood, no signs of struggle, no indication of where Sarah Mitchell might have gone. As the afternoon heat peaked, he returned to her tent and sat in the shade of the overhang, drinking water and trying to think methodically. He picked up her journal again and read backwards through earlier entries. They were exactly what he'd expect from a graduate student conducting field research. Detailed observations, careful documentation of interviews, thoughtful analysis. But as he read, he noticed something. The further back he went, the more frequently Sarah mentioned feelings of being watched. On her first night, she'd written, "Kept waking up with the sense that someone was standing just outside the tent. Perfectly normal psychology of sleeping alone in an unfamiliar environment." On her second night, "Heard what sounded like footsteps circling the camp around 2 a.m. Used my headlamp to check. Saw nothing. Probably mule deer. Need to remember that my nervous system is primed by all the stories I've been collecting." Chris found the recordings folder on her phone. She'd been conducting interviews, backing them up to a cloud service that required cell signal, which she wouldn't have had down here. The most recent recording was labeled Ambient Night 3 Do Not Delete. He pressed play. At first, there was only the sound of a campfire crackling, the soft rush of distant water. Then Sarah's voice barely above a whisper. "It's 2:47 a.m. Something is out there." I can hear it moving around the perimeter of my camp. It's staying just beyond the firelight. I thought it was my imagination at first, but I've been listening for 45 minutes now, and it's definitely there. The pattern is too regular to be random. Circling. Always circling. A pause. The fire popped. I keep wanting to shine my light out there, but RM's warning keeps coming back to me. Don't answer voices, don't acknowledge them. So I'm not looking. I'm keeping my eyes on the fire and recording this because I need to document what I'm experiencing, even if it's just my mind playing tricks. Another long pause. Then, oh God, it just called my name. It sounded exactly like my advisor, Dr. Yazzie. But Dr. Yazzie is in Tucson. He wouldn't be here. He wouldn't be out in the dark calling my name from just beyond the firelight. Chris could hear Sarah's breathing accelerating. It's saying my name again, using his voice. It wants me to come to it. It wants me to step out of the firelight. Every instinct I have is screaming at me not to answer, not to respond, not to acknowledge that I hear it. The voice sounds so concerned, so worried. It's saying there's been an emergency. It's saying I need to come quickly. But I'm not going. I'm not going to answer. A sound in the background of the recording made Chris grip the phone harder. It was a voice, faint but audible, calling Sarah's name with perfect human intonation and inflection. Sarah, Sarah, please, you need to come help me. It's not getting tired, Sarah whispered into the recording. It's been calling me for 10 minutes straight now. Sometimes it sounds like Dr. Yazzie. Sometimes it sounds like my mother. Once it sounded like my roommate. It cycles through voices like it's trying to find the one I'll respond to. This can't be real. This has to be some kind of auditory hallucination brought on by isolation and suggestion. But it sounds so real. The recording continued for another 15 minutes. Chris listened to all of it. Sarah never answered the voice. She never left the firelight. Eventually, the calling stopped. Sarah's breathing slowly returned to normal. The recording ended with her saying simply, "The sun is coming up. Whatever it was, it's gone now." But there was one more recording, time-stamped 7:04 p.m. on the day of her last check-in. Chris's hand trembled slightly as he pressed play. Emergency documentation. Sarah's voice was tight, controlled but barely. I need to record this while I can still think clearly. At approximately 6:30 p.m., I observed an animal approaching from the upper canyon. Initially appeared to be a coyote, typical for the region. I watched it through my binoculars as it moved along the creek bed. About 200 yards from my position, it stopped and looked directly at me. Made eye contact, sustained, unblinking. A shaky breath. Then it stood up, on its hind legs, like a human. And as I watched through 10x magnification in perfect evening light, I saw its body begin to change. The proportions shifted, the snout retracted, the fur seemed to flow, to reconfigure. Within the span of maybe 30 seconds, a coyote became a naked human figure. Male, I think, emaciated, covered in something dark, and it was still looking directly at me. This is impossible, I know this is impossible, but I am a trained observer and I know what I saw. The figure raised one hand and gestured toward me, like a beckoning motion, and I felt this pull. Like my body wanted to respond without my permission, like my legs wanted to walk toward it. I had to physically grab the tent pole to stop myself from standing up. Her breathing had become ragged. I broke eye contact. I looked down at my feet and I counted to 100. When I looked up again, it was gone. But Sarah Mitchell, there are now human footprints leading from the spot where I saw the coyote to within 30 feet of my camp. I photographed them, their bare feet, and when I checked the last few prints with my headlamp, I can see where the toes become longer, where the prints become something else. A long silence. Dr. Yazzie told me the old stories were metaphors, warnings about the corruption of power, about what happens when someone violates the sacred order. But what if they're not metaphors? What if the Yi-Nald Lushi are real? What if I've been documenting something that shouldn't be documented? What if by asking about them, by seeking them out, I've drawn attention? The recording cut off abruptly. Chris set down the phone. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through frameworks, trying to force this into a shape that made sense. Psychological break brought on by isolation. Hallucinogenic plants accidentally ingested. Some elaborate hoax, though he couldn't imagine why or how. But even as he constructed these explanations, he could feel them crumbling under the weight of evidence. The sun was moving toward the western rim of the canyon. In a few hours, it would be dark. Chris needed to make a decision. The protocol was clear: preserve the scene, return to base, bring in a full search and rescue team. But something held him in place. The tracks that changed, the recordings, the way Sarah's voice had sounded when she described fighting the compulsion to walk toward the figure. He checked his GPS. His current coordinates were 37°28'14 N, 111°09'43 W. The nearest road was 12 miles northeast. Cell signal was non-existent. His radio would barely reach base from here, even with the repeater on Devil's Garden. He was alone in a landscape of stone and space, and somewhere out here was a missing woman who had seen something that shouldn't exist. Chris pulled out his topographical map and studied it in the angled sunlight. Sarah had walked somewhere. The human-to-coyote tracks led up the side canyon, which according to his map narrowed considerably after about half a mile before opening into a broader basin. There was a spring marked up there, one of the few reliable water sources in the area. If something, was living in this territory, the spring would be a logical location. He made his decision. He would search the upper canyon before dark. If he found nothing, he'd camp here at Sarah's site and radio for backup at first light. He loaded his pack with essentials: water, first aid, emergency beacon, his service weapon, headlamp, and headed up the side canyon, following the prints. The canyon walls rose steep and red on either side of him, Navajo sandstone carved by occasional floods into smooth curves and overhangs. His boots crunched on sand and small stones. Birds called from somewhere above. Everything was normal, was natural, was explainable by geology and biology and the physics of water and stone. The footprints continued, sometimes human, sometimes coyote, sometimes disturbingly between. Chris photographed each transition, his scientific training taking over even as a deeper part of him registered the impossibility. The prints led him up a series of natural stone steps, through a narrow passage where he had to turn sideways to fit between the walls, and finally into a broader area where a spring seeped from the rock face and collected in a shallow pool. The smell hit him first. It was wrong, deeply wrong. Decay and musk and something else, something that made his hindbrain scream warnings his forebrain couldn't quite process. The spring area was littered with bones, not unusual in itself. Animals died near water sources all the time. But these bones had been arranged, sorted by type. The skulls, dozens of them, coyotes and rabbits and something that might have been a deer, formed a semicircle around the spring. The long bones radiated out like spokes of a wheel, and in the center, partially buried in sand, was a piece of fabric that Chris recognized from Sarah's permit photo. Her blue bandana. He approached slowly, every nerve screaming at him to run. The bandana was torn, stained with something dark. He was reaching for it when he heard the sound behind him. It started as a cough, rough and animal. Then it became something else. It became his daughter's voice. His daughter who was 3,000 miles away in Virginia, safe in her mother's house. His daughter who he hadn't seen in 4 months because of the custody arrangement. Daddy, I'm scared. Why won't you help me? Chris spun around, his hand dropping to his service weapon. The narrow passage he'd come through was empty. The voice came again, from a different direction now. Daddy, please. It's dark, and I'm scared and I can't find my way home. He knew it wasn't her. He knew with absolute certainty that this was what Sarah had described. The thing that cycled through voices, searching for the one that would make him respond. But God, it sounded exactly like Emma. Every inflection, every tremor, the way she said scared with 2 syllables instead of 1. Daddy? The voice was above him now. Chris looked up. On a ledge about 20 feet up the canyon wall, something crouched. In the late afternoon light, It was hard to make out details. It was the right size to be a coyote, but it was balanced on the ledge in a way that wasn't quite right, hunched in a posture that was too vertical, too human. And its eyes caught the light and reflected it back in a way that no animal's eyes should. Not amber, not the typical tapetum lucidum glow of a canine in dim light. These eyes held a different quality entirely, an intelligence that felt alien and ancient and aware. "Daddy, why won't you look at me?" The voice came from the thing on the ledge, but its mouth, snout, didn't move in sync with the words. "Don't you love me anymore? Don't you want to help me?" Chris pulled his weapon, though his hands were shaking now, his rational mind fracturing against the reality of what he was seeing. "You're not my daughter," he managed to say. The thing on the ledge tilted its head, the movement too fluid, too serpentine. When it spoke again, it was in a different voice. Sarah Mitchell's voice. "But I am Sarah. I'm right here, Chris. I've been waiting for you. I knew you'd come. I knew you'd follow the tracks." "Where is she?" Chris's voice came out steadier than he felt. "Where's Sarah Mitchell?" "I'm right here." The thing stood up, and Chris's mind tried to reject what he was seeing. It wasn't standing on 4 legs. It wasn't even standing on 2 legs, in the way a human stands. It was balanced in some intermediate configuration, haunches bent, spine curved, but somehow vertical. "Don't you want to help me? Don't you want to bring me home?" Chris had spent 11 years in the backcountry, and he'd never once fired his weapon outside of qualification. He raised it now, sighting on the center mass of the thing on the ledge, and his training came back to him in a rush. Clear verbal commands. Establish control. De-escalate if possible. "I need you to show me where Sarah Mitchell is. Now." The thing made a sound that could have been laughter, if laughter could sound like bones breaking. "You want to see? You want to see what happens when someone looks too closely at things they shouldn't see? When someone calls out to things they shouldn't name?" It moved then, faster than Chris could track, flowing down the canyon wall in a motion that was neither climbing nor falling. It hit the ground 20 feet from him, and Chris fired. The report was deafening in the narrow canyon, echoing off stone walls. He saw his round hit, saw the impact on the thing's shoulder, saw it barely flinch. It kept coming. Chris fired again, then again. His training, his muscle memory, kept his shots grouped center mass, but the thing wasn't stopping. It crossed the distance between them in seconds, and Chris got a close look at what he was shooting. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a human. It was wearing something. Skin that didn't quite fit, fur that moved wrong, a face that shifted between forms like it couldn't decide what it was supposed to be. And underneath, visible through tears in the skin suit, was something else. Something emaciated and gray and covered in symbols that looked burned into the flesh. Chris's back hit the canyon wall. He had nowhere to go. The thing was right in front of him now, close enough that he could smell the wrongness of it, close enough that he could see where the borrowed skin didn't quite meet around the neck, close enough that he could look into those terrible eyes and see that they weren't empty, weren't animal, but held something that had once been human and had become something much worse. "You can't hurt me," it said in Sarah's voice, in his daughter's voice, in his own voice. "You can't kill what's already broken all the rules. You can't stop what's already died and come back wrong." It reached toward him, and Chris saw its hand shifting, fingers elongating, nails becoming claws. He pressed himself harder against the stone, his weapon empty, his rational mind finally completely shattered. This was real. The stories were real. The warnings were real, and Sarah Mitchell was gone. The thing paused, its hand inches from Chris's face. It tilted its head again, studying him. Then it spoke in a voice that was older than the others, rougher, barely human. "You're not ready to see yet. You're not ready to know. Go back. Tell them she walked away. Tell them she chose to leave. Tell them anything except the truth." It took a step back, then another. Its form began to shift again. Shoulders hunching forward, spine curving, face elongating into something more canine. Chris watched as it dropped to all fours, as the transformation completed. as a coyote stood where a moment before something impossible had been. The coyote looked at him one more time with those two intelligent eyes. Then it turned and loped away, disappearing into the shadows of the upper canyon. Chris stood against the wall for a long time, his empty gun still raised, his heart hammering, his mind trying to process what had happened. Eventually he reloaded with shaking hands. Then he carefully, methodically, picked up Sarah's bandana and put it in an evidence bag. He photographed the bone arrangement. He documented everything with the clinical precision of someone holding on to procedure because it was the only thing left that made sense. When he finally made his way back down to Sarah's camp, the sun was setting. He gathered her gear with the same methodical care, packing everything according to protocol, labeling and documenting. He found her camera and went through the photos. The last few showed the bone arrangement at the spring. The second to last showed something crouched on a distant ledge. When Chris zoomed in on his tablet, he could see the thing clearly, could see that it was watching the camera, could see that it was wearing something that wasn't quite a coyote's shape. He deleted that photo. Then he deleted it from the deleted folder. Then he factory reset the camera and told himself it was to preserve evidence. He hiked out that night, his headlamp carving a small circle of sanity through vast darkness. He didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't let himself think about what would happen if something called his daughter's name from the darkness beyond his light. He just walked, one foot in front of the other, following his GPS back to the trailhead. He reached his vehicle at 3:17 a.m. He sat in the driver's seat with all the doors locked and the engine running, letting the air conditioning wash over him, letting the radio play anything at all just to have human voices, human music, human normalcy. He wrote his report on his laptop, and the words came easily because they were lies. Subject's camp found abandoned, no signs of struggle. Tracks suggest subject walked away from site voluntarily. Search area expanded, but terrain limitations and lack of evidence make recovery unlikely. Recommend case be classified as voluntary disappearance pending further evidence. He submitted the report at dawn. Then he drove back to his office, showered in the facility bathroom, changed into his spare uniform. He went through all the normal motions of ending a search operation. He briefed his supervisor. He answered questions. He filed the evidence. He did everything he was supposed to do. But that night, alone in his apartment, Chris took out Sarah Mitchell's journal and read the last entry again. The tracks change. Below it, her careful illustration of footprints transforming from human to animal. He'd seen it. He'd documented it with his own photos, and then he'd written a report that said none of it happened. Chris looked at his service weapon, still in its holster on his desk. He'd fired 6 rounds into something that shouldn't exist, and it hadn't stopped. It had barely noticed. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, about what she'd seen and what she'd documented and what had happened when she looked too closely at stories that were supposed to stay stories. He thought about the thing wearing skin that didn't fit, about eyes that held intelligence and malice and something utterly inhuman. He thought about it using his daughter's voice, about how it had known exactly which words would hurt him most, and he thought about what it had said. You're not ready to see yet. You're not ready to know. Chris pulled out a fresh notebook and began writing. Not a report, not an official document, but something else. A record of what actually happened, of what he'd actually seen. He wrote for hours, filling page after page with details he'd never put in his official report. He wrote about the tracks that changed, about the recordings, about the thing at the spring. He wrote it all down while it was still fresh, while his mind still held the sharp edges of terror. When he finished, just before dawn, he sealed the notebook in an envelope. He wrote on the front, "To be opened only if I go missing." He put it in his safety deposit box at the bank, along with his will and his daughter's birth certificate and the few other things he needed to keep safe. Then he went back to work. He processed other cases, led other searches, filed other reports. He smiled at appropriate times and frowned at appropriate times and gave no indication that anything inside him had fundamentally changed. But he never went back to Coyote Gulch. And when other rangers mentioned that area, mentioned finding strange tracks or hearing voices in the night, Chris listened carefully and said nothing at all. 3 months later, on a morning where ice crystals formed perfect patterns on his windshield, Chris received a package with no return address. Inside was a single photograph, professional quality, printed on good paper. It showed him walking down the narrow canyon toward the spring, his back to the camera. In the foreground, perfectly in focus, was a coyote sitting on its haunches, watching him pass. The coyote's mouth was open in what might have been a pant, what might have been a grin. Its eyes, even in the photograph, held that terrible intelligence. On the back of the photo, someone had written in neat handwriting, "We're still here, we've always been here, some stories are true." Chris burned the photograph. But sometimes late at night, he could still smell the smoke and musk and wrongness. Sometimes he heard his daughter's voice calling from the darkness, even though she was 3,000 miles away, safe in Virginia. Sometimes he felt the pull, the compulsion to walk into the dark and find out what was really out there in the places between the stories and the science. He never did. He stayed in the light, filed his reports, maintained his reputation as a methodical, rational ranger who'd never lost his head in an emergency. He kept his secrets locked away with that notebook, and he told himself that forgetting was the same as healing. But he knew the truth. Some things couldn't be forgotten. Some things changed you at a level deeper than memory. Chris Dalton had gone into the backcountry as one kind of person, someone who believed the world had rules, had explanations, had order. He'd come back as someone else entirely, someone who knew that the rules had exceptions, that some explanations required accepting the impossible. That order was a thin veneer over something much older and more terrible. He'd come back as someone who understood why some cultures had taboos about speaking certain names, about looking too closely at certain shadows, about following certain tracks. He'd come back as someone who knew that the worst part of knowledge wasn't what you discovered, it was knowing you could never unsee it. And late at night, when the wind moved through the juniper outside his apartment, when it made sounds that almost sounded like voices, Chris would lie awake and wonder about Sarah Mitchell. He'd wonder if she'd walked away voluntarily, drawn by something she couldn't resist. He'd wonder if she was still out there somewhere, changed and changing. He'd wonder if she'd become like the thing he'd seen, wearing a skin that didn't fit, calling to others in voices they couldn't ignore. He'd wonder, and he'd know he'd never have answers, and he'd understand that this itself was a kind of answer. Some questions weren't meant to be resolved. Some mysteries were meant to stay mysterious. Some tracks were meant to change and disappear and leave only the question behind. The last entry in Sarah Mitchell's journal had been, "The tracks change." Chris understood now that she hadn't been describing what she saw. She'd been describing what was about to happen to her. And every time he closed his eyes, he saw those footprints in the sand, transforming from human to animal, from known to unknown, from possible to impossible. He saw them, and he knew they were still out there, still changing, still waiting for the next person who would look too closely, ask too many questions, follow too far. The tracks change. They've always changed. And somewhere in the Grand Staircase Escalante, in the places where the map becomes uncertain and the trail becomes unclear, they're still changing, still calling, still waiting. Some stories are true, and that, Christopher Dalton had learned, was the most terrifying knowledge of all. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Sarah.